Section 1. The nuclear power plant is mutating Springfield. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. You don't need to do anything tonight except listen, because for the next few hours, we're going to drift very slowly through Springfield together. Every theory, every buried mystery, every strange detail that the show has been hiding in plain sight for 36 years. It'll all wash over you, calm and steady. You can let your eyes close whenever they want to. The story will still be here. Let's start with the big one. The Springfield nuclear power plant is mutating the entire town. Not as a metaphor, not as a background joke. Literally, biologically, measurably, the plant is poisoning every single person who has ever lived in Springfield. And the show has been telling us this since season 2. And nobody, not the characters, not most of the audience, has ever stopped to take it completely seriously. But we're going to take it seriously tonight. And once you do, once you really sit with the evidence, something shifts. The whole show starts to look different. Every yellow face, every strange physical feature, every impossible recovery from a near-fatal accident, it all traces back to the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible poison into the same water table that Springfield has been drinking from for decades. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's start with what the show actually tells us, piece by piece, and let it accumulate the way it was always meant to. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, one of the wealthiest men in American fiction, a man so old and so powerful that the town around him has effectively been shaped by his decisions for longer than most of its residents have been alive. The plant provides electricity to the entire town. It is the economic backbone of Springfield. Without it, the town's largest employer disappears, the power goes out, and the carefully constructed illusion of a functioning community collapses almost immediately. And the plant is also, by any reasonable measure, a catastrophe that has been unfolding in slow motion for at least 3 decades. A surprise safety inspection, the kind of inspection that shows up unannounced specifically because announced inspections tend to result in temporary tidying rather than genuine compliance, found 342 violations, 342 separate instances where the facility failed to meet the minimum legal standards for safe nuclear operation. That number is not played for casual laughs in the episode where it appears. It lands heavily. The inspector reads it and there is a pause. The kind of pause that suggests even the person delivering the information can't quite believe what they're saying. The estimated cost to bring the plant into compliance was $56 million, and Mr. Burns refused to spend it. He could afford it. He is a billionaire many times over. A man who at various points in the show's history has been shown possessing wealth so vast it becomes almost abstract, a $1 trillion bill hidden for decades, a private medical infrastructure that would rival a small hospital, the resources to hire private FBI contacts, the capital to buy back a facility that nearly bankrupted a team of German investors when they tried to assess its true repair costs. Burns didn't refuse because the money wasn't there. He refused because spending it would mean admitting the violations existed. And admitting the violations existed would mean someone might start asking questions about what those violations had already done to the people living downwind, downstream, and directly under the plume of whatever has been leaking from those cracked cooling towers for the better part of 40 years. The violations themselves aren't minor paperwork issues. They aren't fire extinguisher placement or insufficient signage in a maintenance corridor. The show is specific about what's actually wrong with the plant, and the specificity is part of what makes this theory hold together so well. Radioactive waste is being dumped directly into bodies of water. This isn't a rumor within the show or a theory proposed by a character who might be unreliable. It is depicted. The waste goes into rivers. The rivers flow through Springfield. The people of Springfield drink from municipal water sources fed by those same rivers. Radioactive waste is also being deposited on children's playgrounds. A playground, specifically. A place where children play every day. Where their hands touch the ground, where they fall and press their faces into the grass, where they spend hours in direct contact with surfaces that have been receiving radioactive material at some unknown but clearly non-zero rate. Plutonium is being used as a paperweight on someone's desk inside the facility. A desk. Regular office work happening in direct proximity to fissile material, treated with the casualness of a stapler. The cooling towers, the large curved structures that are supposed to manage the heat generated by an active nuclear reactor, have cracked sections that were repaired with chewing gum. Chewing gum. A human being looked at a crack in critical reactor infrastructure, had access to the resources of one of the wealthiest men in the country, and made the calculation that a piece of gum was the appropriate response. There are luminous rats running through the lower sections of the facility. Luminous? Glowing. Their bodies visibly producing light in a way that strongly suggests they have absorbed enough radioactive material to cause bioluminescence. These rats are not contained. They run through the bowels of an active nuclear facility. And then there's the detail the show drops and never returns to. Human skeletons in the basement, bones in the basement of the power plant. The episode that reveals this doesn't explain who those people were. It doesn't explain how they ended up there, how they died, whether their deaths were connected to the facility's operations, or whether Burns ever answered for them. The camera shows the bones and moves on. The show keeps moving. And the people of Springfield, including the character who discovers the skeletons, seem to absorb the information and file it somewhere that doesn't require action. That reaction, or rather the absence of one, is itself a clue. We'll come back to it, now. The man whose job it is to stand between all of this and the population of Springfield. The man legally designated as the safety inspector for this facility. The person whose actual documented function is to ensure that none of what we just described is allowed to happen or to continue. That man is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, whose IQ has been stated by the show's own creator to be 55. Homer Simpson, who in a later season is revealed to have had a crayon lodged in his brain since early childhood, physically pressing against cognitive tissue and reducing his functional intelligence well below whatever its baseline might otherwise have been. Homer Simpson, who is depicted sleeping at his workstation, eating donuts during meltdown warnings, and who once triggered a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core, apparently to test whether proximity to a nuclear reaction would cause the donut to increase in size. That is who stands between Springfield and catastrophe. That is the gatekeeper. And he has been at that post, failing in increasingly spectacular ways for over 30 years. The show presents Homer's incompetence as the premise of a workplace comedy, and it is very funny. Homer's relationship with his job at the nuclear plant is one of the foundational running gags of the series. But if you step back from the comedy for a moment and consider the actual implications, a safety inspector who cannot stay awake, who does not understand the basic operating principles of the facility he monitors, who was retained specifically because his incompetence guarantees. The violations continue, the joke starts to darken very quickly. Burns didn't hire Homer by accident. This is established in the show quite directly. When German investors briefly purchased the plant during one period of the show's run, they immediately identified Homer as a liability and fired him. These were business people with fresh eyes, no personal relationship to Homer, no stake in keeping him employed, and their first assessment of the situation was that this particular safety inspector needed to go. Then they looked at the actual cost of bringing the facility into compliance and nearly went bankrupt from the estimate alone. Burns bought the plant back. Homer was rehired almost immediately after Burns returned. A competent safety inspector would begin shutting things down within a week of arriving at this facility with clear eyes and authority. Homer's continued presence in that role ensures the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. And Burns maintains his monopoly over not just Springfield's electricity supply, but in a more fundamental sense, over the town itself. Now let's talk about Blinky. In Season 2, a fish is pulled from a river near the power plant. The fish has 3 eyes. Its name becomes Blinky, and the discovery immediately becomes national news within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as the centerpiece of his campaign against Mr. Burns, arguing that the 3-eyed fish is evidence that Burns is poisoning the local environment. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to prove that everything is fine, that the fish is perfectly normal and safe, that there's nothing alarming about a 3-eyed specimen pulled from a river downstream of a nuclear facility. The town watches. There is a brief period of attention and concern, and then it fades. No follow-up studies are conducted. No water testing is commissioned. No environmental review is ordered. The show moves on, and the people of Springfield move on with it. But here is the question the show never asks directly, the one that sits at the center of this entire theory. If the fish in that river have developed a third eye, if the radioactive contamination is severe enough to cause a visible, dramatic, genetic mutation in the wildlife, then what is happening to the people drinking the same water? The answer, the show suggests, has been right in front of us for decades. In Season 8, an episode called The Springfield Files gives us the most important piece of evidence for the mutation theory, dressed up as a lighthearted X-Files parody. Homer sees something in the woods near Springfield, a glowing, stumbling, vaguely humanoid figure. He reports it as an alien encounter. The FBI sends agents Mulder and Scully to investigate. The town panics pleasantly, and when the truth is finally revealed, the figure in the woods isn't an alien at all. It's Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment, a regimen so chemically intensive, so loaded with experimental compounds and controlled radiation exposure, that it gives his entire body a visible green glow. The treatments keep him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without them, he would die. And after each session, Burns stumbles out of the treatment facility in a dazed, almost euphoric state, wandering through the woods like something that has forgotten what it means to move normally. The show plays this as a punchline. The alien was Burns all along, but the implications are extraordinary. Burns is so thoroughly saturated with radiation, both from the treatments designed to keep him alive and from a lifetime of proximity to an active nuclear facility, that his body literally emits visible light. He glows in the dark, and the people of Springfield see this glowing figure in the forest, and their first instinct, the first thing their minds reach for, is alien, not radiation, not the massive nuclear plant that dominates their skyline, an extraterrestrial visitor. That tells you something about where the town's collective mind has gotten to after decades of contamination. In the Simpsons movie, the accumulation of evidence becomes impossible to ignore even within the fiction of the show. Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a point so catastrophic that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal agency operating within the show's universe, with real authority and real jurisdiction, determines that the town must be physically sealed. A massive glass dome is lowered over Springfield to prevent the pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. Take that in for a moment. The federal government of the United States, operating within the logic of the Simpsons universe, looked at Springfield and concluded that the appropriate response was total containment. The town was classified as an environmental hazard, not a problem to be managed with regulations and fines and eventual remediation, a hazard severe enough to require physical isolation from the surrounding world. Springfield is, in the eyes of the federal government within this story, a contamination zone. And every resident who has been drinking that water, breathing that air, living in the shadow of those cracked cooling towers, they're all inside the dome when it goes up. Now, let's look at the residents themselves. Actually look at them. Homer Simpson has a skull shape that doesn't conform to normal human anatomy. His eyes bulge in a way that suggests either thyroid dysfunction or significant structural abnormality. He has 4 fingers on each hand, which is a characteristic shared by every person in Springfield, and not, as far as we know, any documented human population anywhere on Earth. His overbite is extreme. His IQ, as established, places him in a range that would qualify for clinical cognitive disability under any modern diagnostic framework. But more striking than any of these is what Homer's body can do. He has been shot, he has been electrocuted. He has fallen from significant heights repeatedly. He has been in car accidents. He has been hit by vehicles moving at speed. He has survived explosions. He has walked away from every single instance of trauma that, in a real human body, would have resulted in serious injury or death, often multiple times over. His healing rate is absurd. His pain tolerance operates well outside the range of normal human biology, and he has spent the entirety of his adult working life in direct proximity to an active nuclear reactor with 342 unresolved safety violations. Marge Simpson has the same bulging eyes, the same 4-fingered hands, and hair that defies the laws of physics and gravity, growing straight upward in a tower of a specific height and shape that she has maintained, through some unknown structural means, for 36 years, without apparent variation. Marge also worked at the plant herself at one point. She was exposed to the same facility, the same violations, the same leaking radiation, and she returned to the household carrying whatever dose she accumulated during that period. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie were all born in Springfield, raised in Springfield, and have grown up in the contamination zone their entire lives. All three of them display physical characteristics that fall outside the range of normal human biological variation. The spiky hair that maintains its shape without product, the overbites, the bulging eyes, the yellow skin that covers every Springfield resident and no one else in the entire show. That last detail is the one that really snaps the theory into focus. When guest characters arrive in Springfield, when celebrities visit, when people from outside the town appear in the story, they look different. Meaningfully different. Their proportions are more natural. Their eyes conform more closely to standard human anatomy. Their features don't carry the same extreme exaggeration that marks every person who actually lives in Springfield. The show draws outsiders with noticeably more realistic physical proportions than the people who call Springfield home. The standard explanation for this, the one the show has always offered implicitly, is that it's simply the art style. That's just how The Simpsons looks. Everyone in the show is drawn that way. It's a cartoon. But here's the problem with that explanation. Within the established logic of the show's own universe, there is a visible, observable, consistent difference between people who live in Springfield and people who come from elsewhere. The people inside the contamination zone have bodies that look mutated. The people outside it look comparatively normal. And the show draws that distinction deliberately and consistently, season after season. Even the animals are affected. The family dog, Santa's little helper, has the same bulging eyes as his owners. The same physical proportions that diverge from what actual greyhound anatomy looks like. Blinky the fish has 3 eyes. Springfield's wildlife is measurably, visibly impacted by the plant's runoff. The show tells us this directly. It shows us a 3-eyed fish and labels it as the product of nuclear contamination, and then expects us to believe that the identical contamination flowing through the same ecosystem had no meaningful effect on the human beings living in it. That gap between the implication and the stated position has been sitting in the middle of the show for 36 years. Burns knows. The show makes this clear across multiple episodes, in ways that accumulate over time into something that looks very much like deliberate concealment. Burns funds private medical research. He has personal physicians who are clearly operating outside the boundaries of conventional medicine. He undergoes the weekly treatments we discussed, treatments that are specifically designed to manage the biological effects of radiation exposure in a human body. Burns understands what radiation does to living organisms better than anyone in Springfield, because radiation is the thing that is keeping him alive. His body has become dependent on controlled exposure to nuclear material in order to maintain its basic functions. A man who understands radiation that intimately, who owns the facility producing it, who has access to monitoring equipment and water testing capabilities, and a pharmaceutical division that man knows what his plant is doing to the town around it. He cannot not know, and the evidence strongly suggests he has known for a very long time and has made a deliberate decision to keep the knowledge to himself. Homer's continued employment, as we discussed, isn't negligence. It's architecture. Homer ensures the violations continue, the radiation keeps leaking, the water stays contaminated, and a population that has been absorbing low-level neurological damage from that contamination for decades remains, as a result, too cognitively impaired to organize effectively against the man causing the damage. The crayon in Homer's brain, revealed in Season 12, seems at first like a quirky, standalone revelation. Homer once had the crayon removed and his IQ surged to genius level. He became articulate, perceptive, capable of understanding the world around him in ways that had previously been inaccessible. He saw Springfield clearly. He saw his job clearly. He saw the architecture of his own situation with a precision that was, apparently, unbearable. So he had the crayon put back in. He chose the fog over the clarity because clarity in Springfield is too heavy to carry. But consider the question the show never asks directly. How did a crayon get lodged in a child's brain in the first place without anyone noticing? How did Homer move through his entire childhood, his adolescence, his adult life visiting Springfield doctors, getting routine examinations, going through the healthcare system of a town with multiple functioning hospitals without a single medical professional finding a foreign object in his skull? Either every doctor in Springfield is incompetent beyond any reasonable explanation, or someone knew it was there and chose not to remove it. If the medical establishment in Springfield is compromised, If the doctors are looking the other way while something damages their patient's neurological function, if Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of a town he essentially owns, then Homer's crayon isn't just a strange accident. It's a data point in a pattern. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains, something that keeps them compliant and incurious, something that prevents them from looking up at those cracked cooling towers and asking the most basic question a human being can ask. Why are we all like this? The radiation theory, when you lay it out fully, doesn't explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains all of them. The characters don't age because their biology has been altered at a cellular level. The town resets after catastrophic events because the population's capacity for sustained memory and consequential thinking has been degraded by chronic neurological exposure. Homer survives injuries that should kill him because his body has adapted to radiation in ways that make him extraordinarily resilient, even as it has left him cognitively devastated. Burns stays alive through treatments that would kill an ordinary person because he has spent decades managing his own relationship with nuclear material using resources that nobody else in Springfield can access. Springfield isn't a quirky cartoon town. It's a contamination zone. The residents aren't eccentric. They're symptomatic. And the nuclear plant that dominates their skyline, that powers their homes, that employs their neighbors and poisons their water, it isn't a background gag. It's the cause. It has always been the cause. Every impossible recovery, every forgotten catastrophe, every unexplained reset, every yellow face with bulging eyes and four fingers, it all traces back to the same source. The plant isn't part of the show. The plant is the show. And nobody in Springfield will ever figure that out because the plant already made sure they can't. Hey, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is. It's always interesting to see how far this reaches. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribing means you'll always have something to drift off to. Now let's keep going. Section 2, Homer's coma theory. Everything we just talked about, the radiation, the mutations, the contaminated water, Burns and his empire of slow poison, all of that might be true. But it might only be true inside the mind of a man who has been unconscious since 1993. Settle in a little more. Let the lights stay low. Because this next theory is the one that reframes everything that came before it and everything that comes after. It's the one that, once it gets into your head, tends to stay there. On April 1st, 1993, the 18th episode of Season 4 aired. The title was So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was relatively contained. Bart plays a series of April Fool's Day pranks on Homer, each one escalating beyond the last, until the final prank involves taking one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker. The can is shaken at high speed for an extended period. When Homer opens it, the resulting explosion sends him to the hospital. While Homer is lying in his hospital bed, recovering from the explosion, he notices a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He gets up to get it. The machine tips over, crushes him, and Homer Simpson flatlines. He enters a clinically confirmed coma, a real coma. The episode is careful to establish this. It isn't presented as a dream sequence or a cutaway gag. Homer is unconscious in a medical facility, his brain activity dramatically reduced, and the show depicts his family gathering at his bedside waiting for him to come back. The episode ends with Homer waking up. Bart confesses tearfully that the whole thing was his fault, and Homer snaps awake and immediately begins strangling his son, to the laughter of everyone in the room. The family is relieved. Everything goes back to normal. The show continues, except, and this is the part the show mentions, and then immediately moves past. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5% gone permanently, the show confirms, never to be recovered. And Homer's reaction to being told that he has sustained permanent brain damage is to laugh, even though he says, in the same breath, that he doesn't know why he's laughing. The family finds this charming rather than alarming. The episode ends. The show then continued for 32 more seasons, as if that scene had never happened. Unless, the theory goes, something did happen. Unless Homer never actually woke up. This is the Homer coma theory. It is the single most debated, most discussed, most internally coherent fan theory in the history of The Simpsons, and the basic argument is simple. Homer Simpson did not wake up from his coma in April of 1993. Every episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every celebrity appearance, every impossible event and emotional resolution and foreign adventure is a dream. A long, wandering, increasingly surreal dream being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits beside him and waits. The evidence is genuinely unsettling once you start paying attention to it. The most observable piece of evidence is the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not realistic in the way that a drama is realistic, but grounded in the sense that its storylines dealt with recognizable human problems. Homer tries to quit drinking. Marge considers the possibility of an affair. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher. Bart faces being held back a year at school because of his grades. These are the kinds of situations that real families move through: financial strain, marital tension, academic failure, the ordinary weight of domestic life rendered through the lens of satire, but still recognizable as the kind of thing that happens to people. The emotional core of those early seasons was built on something true. The Simpsons worked as a show because underneath the comedy, it was about the things that actually matter to people, about being enough, about keeping a family together, about the gap between who you hoped you'd be and who you've become. After the coma, everything changes. The shift is not subtle. It is enormous, and it happens relatively quickly. Homer goes to space. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer joins a secret society. Homer discovers that his mother, who he believed to be dead, is actually alive and has been living as a radical fugitive. Homer meets God twice, in person, and has direct conversations with him. The show transforms from a family sitcom anchored in economic anxiety and relatable domestic life into something much stranger, a show where the main character has met multiple sitting presidents, traveled to dozens of countries, held hundreds of different jobs, befriended and alienated more celebrities than most people encounter in a lifetime, and survived physical trauma that would be immediately fatal to any real human being. The internet has been arguing about when The Simpsons got bad, or at least different, for 20 years. The coma theory offers a very specific answer. The show didn't deteriorate. Homer's brain did. In the early seasons, the show was grounded because Homer's unconscious mind was still relatively intact. The dreams were coherent. They tracked with real life. But as the coma extends, as the weeks turn into months, and the months turn into years, Homer's brain slowly loses its capacity to maintain the internal logic of the simulation. The dreams get stranger. The rules get looser. Reality bends more easily. Things happen that couldn't happen, and nobody in the dream notices or questions them because the dreaming brain generating the story can no longer maintain consistent physics or consistent consequence. The escalation of absurdity across the show's run isn't lazy writing. In this reading, it's neurological deterioration. Homer's brain is getting worse, and the dream reflects that. Now, 6 months before the coma episode, in the Season 4 premiere, an episode called Homer the Heretic Homer has a conversation with God. A real conversation, face to face, the kind that is depicted within the show's logic as an actual divine encounter rather than a metaphor or a dream. And during that conversation, God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. God says Homer's time is coming. He says it in a way that feels significant rather than incidental. A promise? Or perhaps a warning. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline matches. If you read that divine conversation through the lens of the coma theory, if God's message to Homer wasn't a theological platitude, but an actual description of what was about to happen, then what God was telling Homer is that his conscious life was nearly over, that the waking world was about to close, and everything that followed would exist in a different kind of space entirely. And then 6 months later, a vending machine fell. The aging problem is where the coma theory becomes, in some ways, more satisfying than any other explanation the show has offered, or that fans have proposed. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa is 8. Maggie is 1. Homer and Marge exist in what appears to be their mid-30s and have not accumulated a visible year since the show began. The show uses what the television industry calls A floating timeline. The present is always the present, and the characters are always the age they were when the show started. Most animated shows do some version of this, and most audiences simply accept it as a feature of the format. But no other animated show has been running long enough for the floating timeline to create the kind of cognitive dissonance that The Simpsons has now generated. 36 years of a 10-year-old boy. 36 years of a 1-year-old baby. At some point, the rationalization requires more effort than it used to. Every theory tries to explain the aging problem. The radiation theory says the mutation has altered the character's cellular biology in ways that prevent normal aging. The cartoon logic explanation simply invokes the format. But the coma theory has an answer that is emotionally and structurally the most elegant one available. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April of 1993 and never came back. His children don't age because he wasn't there to see them grow up. His unconscious brain cannot imagine them at 12 or 15 or 25 because it has no material to work from. The last time he saw them, they were exactly the ages they are in every episode. His wife doesn't age because the last real image his brain holds of her is the face she had on the day he lost consciousness. His neighbors don't change because the mind generating the simulation is working from memory, and memory is frozen at the moment the vending machine fell. Homer's coma dream preserves the world exactly as it was on the day he lost it, because that is what dreams do. They don't update. They don't receive new information from outside. They work with whatever was already there, running the same material through endless variations without the capacity to introduce genuinely new data. The celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons of the show make sense through this lens. Homer's coma brain, lying in a hospital bed, is not perfectly isolated. Sounds enter the room from the television mounted on the wall, from conversations happening nearby, from the radio, from the ambient noise of a working medical facility. Names float in. Voices register at some subconscious level. Cultural references drift through the fog of unconsciousness and land somewhere in the dreaming mind. The brain processes them the way a dreaming brain processes everything imperfectly, with strange transformations, folding them into the existing narrative in ways that don't quite follow the logic of the waking world. That's why later seasons of the show are saturated with famous faces. It isn't that Springfield became a magnet for celebrities. It's that Homer's brain is absorbing fragments of external sound and image, translating them into dream characters, inserting them into the simulation. Every famous person who shows up in Springfield is, in this reading, a voice Homer heard through the fog, a name from a television program playing in the hospital, a face glimpsed during a moment of partial consciousness reinterpreted by a mind that can't quite get it right but keeps trying. The show itself has acknowledged this theory in a way that feels like an admission wrapped in a denial. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included a deliberately leaked fake deleted scene. In this scene, Homer wakes up from a long coma, and the reveal is explicit. Everything we've been watching was a dream. The show's writers created this. They animated it. They released it into the world where it circulated and caused exactly the kind of excitement and speculation you'd expect from a piece of content that appears to confirm the single most popular fan theory in the show's history. And then they walked it back. They said it was a hoax, a scene planted by hackers. Not real, just kidding. But the fact that they made it at all tells you something. The writers know about the theory. They've engaged with it closely enough to produce a fully realized version of what a confirmation would look like. They showed their audience the truth or something that looked exactly like the truth and then told them it was a joke. And the audience laughed, which is exactly what Homer did when he was told about his permanent brain damage. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in 2015 and dismissed it as fan speculation. But there are things he didn't address. He didn't explain the tonal shift. He didn't explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He didn't explain why the show has become progressively more detached from the kind of recognizable reality it depicted in its early seasons, in a progression that maps almost exactly onto what you'd expect from a mind in gradual decline. He said it wasn't true, and the interviewer moved on. The fans didn't move on. Because the theory does something that the official position has never done. It makes the show make sense. All of it. Every piece that doesn't fit the aging freeze, the tonal drift, the celebrity flood, the cartoon physics plots, the reset button that erases consequences and restores the status quo between every episode. The coma theory absorbs all of it without contradiction. Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode because in the dream, he never left. Homer's body can survive anything because his body is in a hospital bed. Nothing is actually happening to it. Only his mind is in Springfield. And his mind can't kill him because his mind is the one telling the story. There is a version of this theory that sits with you long after the analysis is done. If the coma theory is true, then the emotional center of The Simpsons is not comedy. It is the deepest kind of longing. Homer's most desperate wish, the one his dreaming brain returns to again and again across 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, is heartbreakingly ordinary. He wants his family. That's the whole thing. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his chaotic little boy. He wants Lisa to play her saxophone. He wants to hold Maggie. He wants to be home on a Friday night, full from dinner, watching something on television, the kids doing whatever kids do, the house a little messy, Marge's voice somewhere in the background, the whole ordinary, fragile structure of family life intact around him. The dream gives him this. The dream gives him the family preserved in amber, the children always young, the wife always there, the home always standing. The nightmare scenario, the one the dreaming mind is running from, is not a monster or a disaster. The nightmare is waking up. Because waking up means finding out how much time has passed, finding out how old Bart and Lisa and Maggie really are, finding out whether Marge waited, finding out whether anyone is still sitting by the bed or not waking up at all, which is the other possibility the theory holds open. Homer's coma isn't a nightmare. In this reading, it is the only heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. A house on Evergreen Terrace where the kids are young and the beer is cold and nobody ever has to say goodbye. Every time the credits roll and everything resets, every time Springfield returns to baseline and the impossible things are forgotten, it isn't repetition. It's the dream refusing to end. It's Homer's mind holding on as hard as it can, for as long as it can, to the only thing that matters. And every episode you've ever watched, in this reading, is a love letter, sent from an unconscious man in a hospital bed to the family he can't reach. Section 3: Who Really Shot Mr. Burns? Everyone knows Maggie did it. The show told us it was Maggie. Season 7, Episode 1. The case was closed, the mystery was solved, the baby had a gun, and Mr. Burns reached for her lollipop and the rest was history. Move on. Except, the more you look at this mystery, and a great many people have looked at it very closely over the years, the less settled it actually seems. The official answer has problems. Real problems. The kind of problems that suggest either the show's writers assembled a mystery and then chose a resolution that didn't fully honor the evidence they'd laid down, or that Springfield's power structure managed the investigation the way Springfield manages everything, which is to say, in the direction of the most convenient outcome rather than the most truthful one. Let's go back to the beginning and let the story unfold properly. Season 6, Episode 25, Who Shot Mr. Burns, Part 1, the summer of 1995. The Simpsons pulled off something that had genuinely never been attempted by an animated television series, a real, meticulous mystery. A classic whodunit, structured with actual clues and red herrings, promoted like a cultural event. The show invited viewers to participate in a national contest to guess the identity of the shooter. The winner would be animated into a future episode. Fox ran the promotion heavily. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special treating the fictional crime as though it were an actual unsolved case. For an entire summer, the question of who shot Mr. Burns was a genuine piece of popular culture. The setup for why it happened is thorough and careful. Burns had, during the events of Part 1, systematically destroyed significant parts of Springfield's community infrastructure in the service of one ambitious scheme. He stole an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary, gutting the school's budget. He shut down Moe's Tavern by bankrupting its owner through economic pressure. He created a sinkhole that destroyed the Springfield retirement castle. He injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog. And then, as his grand finale, the move that converted everyone in town from merely aggrieved to genuinely furious, he built a giant mechanical disc and used it to block the sun over the entire town. Not figuratively, Burns actually removed sunlight from Springfield as a business strategy, forcing every resident to purchase their electricity from the power plant because no natural light could reach them. When Smithers protested this, when even the most loyal person in Burns's life found a line he wasn't willing to cross, Burns fired him on the spot. By the end of part one, every significant character in the show had a clear, established, specific motive for wanting Burns dead. The writers took their time with this. They built it carefully. Homer, because Burns couldn't remember his name despite Homer working for him for years, a humiliation that had been building to a genuine breaking point. Bart and Lisa, because the school lost its funding. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because he lost his job. Tito Puente, because Burns cut the music program. Mo, because his bar went under. Smithers, freshly fired and spiraling into something that looked like a genuine crisis. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns. Multiple characters were visible with weapons. Tensions had reached the kind of pitch where violence felt not just possible but probable. And then Burns collapsed. A single gunshot wound. He staggered onto the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on two specific letters, W and S, or, from Burns's own perspective, upside down, M and S. The ambulance took him away. The screen went dark. America waited the entire summer. When Part 2 arrived in September of 1995, it played out like a comedic procedural Chief Wiggum and the Springfield police fumbling through an investigation with all the competence their track record would suggest. Smithers confessed almost immediately, but his confession fell apart when it became clear he had been blackout drunk during the relevant window and had actually shot someone entirely different, old Jasper, in his wooden leg, a crime that the show treats as so minor it barely registers. One by one, the suspects were cleared, alibis were established, and then police found a key piece of evidence: an eyelash on Burns's suit. DNA analysis traced it to a Simpson. Fingerprints found on the gun matched Homer's. Homer had the clearest motive of almost anyone in town. He was arrested. He was about to be convicted. And then Burns woke up and identified his attacker. Maggie Simpson. Baby Maggie. According to Burns's account, he encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting, attempted to take her lollipop, and in the struggle, his gun fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Mystery solved. Except, let's be precise about the problems. The national contest, first, Fox invited Americans to solve the mystery, promoted the contest extensively, and declared that the clues provided in Part 1 were sufficient to identify the shooter. Thousands of entries came in. According to the DVD commentary for the episodes recorded by the writers themselves, not a single person in the randomly selected review sample guessed the correct answer. Not one. The prize winner was chosen randomly from the pool and, since they hadn't identified Maggie, received a cash payment instead of the promised animation appearance. The writers acknowledged on that same commentary that they were aware of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer online the night the episode aired. That person had used a college internet account. By the time the contest concluded and production tried to track them down, the account was gone. They could not find them. An open invitation was eventually extended through the DVD release for that person to identify themselves. As far as anyone knows publicly, they never did. This is worth sitting with. The show's creators designed a mystery, told the public it was solvable from the evidence in Part 1, ran a national contest around that premise, and when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody in a large sample of dedicated viewers had figured it out. Either the clues were not as sufficient as advertised, the red herrings were substantially more effective than the actual evidence, or the answer that was ultimately chosen did not follow as naturally from the established clues as the show suggested it did. The sundial is the central piece of evidence the show uses to support its conclusion. Burns falls. His hands land on W and S. The show tells us this stands for the initials of his attacker, viewed from his perspective, M and S. Maggie Simpson. Case closed. But Burns stated directly in the episode, on camera, that his hands pointing at those letters was not intentional. He didn't deliberately position himself on the sundial to spell out his attacker's initials. He fell. It was an accident of positioning. The man who was shot says explicitly that the most dramatic clue in the mystery was a coincidence, which means the single most iconic piece of evidence, the image that ran in every promotional piece, that became the cultural shorthand for the entire mystery is, by the victim's own account, meaningless. Then there's the question of the gun. Burns carried a firearm in a holster. Before the shooting, the holster is shown empty. The gun was already missing from his person before the attack actually happened. Someone had already taken it. Whoever shot Burns used Burns's own weapon against him, meaning the shooter was someone who had access to the gun before the confrontation in the parking lot. This tells us something specific about the nature of the crime. The shooter was not someone who arrived at the town meeting armed and planning violence. The shooter was someone who found Burns's gun by some means and used it in what may have been an unplanned moment. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile, yes. But so do a significant number of other characters who weren't carrying weapons that evening. Burns's last words before being shot, the final thing he said before the gun went off were, according to the established account, something like recognition. He saw his attacker and his response was not fear or surprise, but something closer to acknowledgement. The show renders this as a calm, almost casual recognition of a familiar face. The thing he says is essentially, "Oh, it's you." "Oh, it's you" is not how you greet a complete stranger. It isn't the response of a man encountering someone randomly in a parking lot for the first time. "Oh, it's you" is the response of someone recognizing a specific person they have a prior relationship with. Someone whose presence, while perhaps unexpected, makes sense in context. Does Burns have a prior relationship with Maggie? Has he ever meaningfully interacted with her before this episode? The show doesn't establish any connection between Burns and the Simpson baby. Burns barely recognizes Homer Simpson, a man who has worked for him for years, whose name he cannot retain, whose face he encounters regularly. The idea that Burns would see an infant in a parking lot and respond with the calm recognition of someone greeting a known acquaintance is genuinely difficult to square with everything the show has established about his social awareness and his relationship to the Simpson family. In season 18, Homer states out loud, on camera, in a context where other characters are present, that he was actually the one who shot Burns. He says it directly. And the response from the room is essentially nothing. Nobody investigates this. Nobody calls the police. Nobody reopens the case. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the wealthiest man in Springfield, and the show treats it as though he had mentioned a preference for a particular brand of soda. The line arrives and departs without consequence. Two readings are available. Either Homer is lying for reasons related to his general character, he enjoys drama, he exaggerates, he sometimes makes claims that aren't grounded in what actually happened, or the original verdict was incorrect, and Homer knows it because he was there. If the second reading is right, then Maggie was, in some sense, a convenient answer. A baby cannot be prosecuted. Chief Wiggum says this explicitly in the episode. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Maggie was the perfect resolution to a situation that needed to be closed without anyone going to prison. One of the most compelling alternative theories involves Marge. The argument is structurally sound. Marge watched Burns destroy her children's school, injure her family's dog, and steal the sun from her town. She had accumulated grievances against Burns that were personal and specific in ways that some of the other suspects were not. And Burns, in an earlier episode, had fallen into a form of infatuation with Marge, an episode where he pursued her romantically and was rejected, an experience that nonetheless established an emotional connection of some kind on his part. If Burns recognized Marge in that parking lot, if he looked at his attacker and felt not fear, but something complicated, something closer to the recognition of a person he had complicated feelings about, then his choice to not clearly identify her to investigators might make a certain kind of sense. He protected her. He woke from a coma with a bullet wound, and rather than name the woman who had shot him, he let the investigation find its own resolution. And the resolution it found was a baby who could never be punished. The alternate endings that were produced and shown add another layer. A fully animated, fully voiced alternate conclusion was created in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. It was shown in The Simpsons' 138th episode Spectacular, a clip show hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses the Smithers ending by explaining that it wouldn't have worked because the Simpson DNA evidence would have to be ignored, which, he says, would be downright nutty. This line is delivered with what feels like a knowing wink at the audience, and the wink lands harder once you consider its reference point. The O.J. Simpson trial, which was happening during the same period when the Burns shooting was being written and produced, was a case where a jury did ignore DNA evidence to reach an acquittal. Troy McClure is essentially telling the audience that ignoring physical evidence is something that happens all the time, that the official answer isn't automatically the right one, that the people with power to frame an investigation can point it wherever they choose. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers took this seriously enough to develop it before moving away from it. The point is that Maggie was not the predetermined answer. The mystery was not constructed from the beginning with Maggie as the solution and the clues laid in reverse from there. The answer was chosen, and then the evidence was adjusted to accommodate the choice. Which means the clues don't actually prove Maggie did it, they prove that the writers eventually decided Maggie did it and worked backward from that decision. In a town where every single person had a motive, where dozens of characters were openly carrying weapons, where the community had been systematically harmed by one man's greed, how is it possible that only one person acted? Springfield's population is not historically restrained. These are people who riot over trivial disputes. They form mobs with minimal provocation. They have, on multiple occasions, burned down community infrastructure over misunderstandings. But when Burns blocks out the sun and threatens the survival of every living thing in the area, one person pulls a trigger. Either Springfield exercised a level of collective restraint completely inconsistent with everything we know about it, or the shooting wasn't as simple or as singular as the official account suggests. The final shot of Part 2. Everyone has left the room. Maggie is alone. She checks her surroundings, confirms she's not being observed, and performs a motion with her pacifier that mimics pulling a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation, but the alternative reading is equally available. A baby who witnessed a shooting might very naturally mimic the action she saw someone perform, the way babies mimic everything they observe. Maggie isn't necessarily confessing. She might be remembering. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was never solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those are two different things. Section 4. How is Mr. Burns still alive? Let's talk about the oldest man in Springfield. Let's talk about the man who might be the oldest functioning person in America, who has been alive longer than most of the institutions that were designed to regulate people like him, and who continues to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation with a strategic clarity that most people a third of his age would struggle to match. How is Mr. Burns still alive? This isn't rhetorical. Within the established logic of The Simpsons, Charles Montgomery Burns is a medical impossibility. His age has been stated, implied, and then contradicted across dozens of episodes, but every version of the timeline places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s. He has personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has told stories about events from the 1910s as first-hand experience. He references historical figures who died before most of his employees were born, not as history lessons, but as personal recollection, the way you'd mention someone you worked with years ago. By the most conservative estimate that the show allows for, Burns is comfortably over 100 years old. By a more expansive reading of the show's continuity, he might be significantly older. And he doesn't just exist at this age, he functions. He runs a corporation. He manipulates municipal politics with deliberate, long-term strategic thinking. He maintains schemes that require memory, planning, and an operational understanding of modern finance and modern law. His body is frail, his physical strength is essentially non-existent, a fact the show deploys for comedy regularly. But his mind is sharp. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield, operating with a ruthlessness and a long view that nobody else in the show's universe can match. How has he sustained both the life and the cognition for this long? The show addresses this, and the answer is both stranger and more specific than you might expect. We've already discussed the Springfield Files and what it revealed about Burns's weekly treatments, the medical regimen so intensive that it makes his body emit a visible green glow. Let's stay with that for a moment and think about what it actually implies. Burns's continued existence is not a natural biological process. He is being kept alive artificially through a recurring medical intervention that must be administered on a precise weekly schedule. If he misses a treatment, he dies. The margin is zero. His survival is maintained the way you maintain a machine through regular, scheduled servicing performed by specialists who understand the system's requirements. The treatment itself involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, who has been in proximity to nuclear material for potentially his entire professional career, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his basic biological functions. This is the detail that locks the radiation theory and the Burns immortality theory into the same framework. Burns isn't just profiting from radiation, he's powered by it. His body has been so thoroughly altered by decades of nuclear exposure that it can no longer sustain itself through normal cellular processes. It requires an external input of controlled radiation, the way a normal body requires food and water. Deprive it of that input for a week, and the system fails. This explains something the show has depicted repeatedly but never examined directly. Burns's immune system, or rather the extraordinary state of disease that his immune system is navigating. In one of the most quoted scenes in the entire series, Burns visits a doctor who delivers news that is simultaneously the most alarming medical assessment imaginable, and somehow also the thing that explains Burns's survival. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Not one disease, not several diseases. All of them, simultaneously, all present in his body at the same time. The doctor's explanation is that these diseases exist in a state of perfect equilibrium. Each illness is canceling out the others. Every pathogen, every condition, every degenerative process is present and active in Burns's body, but because all of them are competing for resources simultaneously, none of them can gain the dominance required to actually kill him. The doctor calls it Three Stooges syndrome, like three people trying to fit through a doorway at once. They all get stuck. Burns's diseases are all trying to kill him, but they're all blocked by each other. The show plays this as comedy. But if you accept the radiation theory, it stops being a joke and becomes something that makes a terrifying kind of biological sense. Burns's body isn't maintaining this disease equilibrium through any natural process. The weekly radiation treatments are doing it. The treatments don't cure his diseases. There is no cure for every disease simultaneously. What the treatments do is manage them. They keep every condition in a state of controlled stasis, balanced against every other condition, preventing any single disease from progressing to the point of killing him. It's not medicine in any conventional sense, it's nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is a reactor, and his weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a meltdown. The relationship between Burns and Smithers, understood through this lens, shifts from a story about devotion and affection into something more structurally significant. Smithers isn't just Burns's most loyal employee, he is Burns's life support system in its operational form. Smithers manages Burns's schedule, which means Smithers manages the treatment schedule. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with a vigilance that the show sometimes depicts as obsessive, but that makes complete practical sense once you understand what he's actually monitoring. Smithers knows that Burns must receive his weekly treatment. Smithers knows that if Burns misses that treatment, the disease equilibrium collapses and every illness in his body surges forward simultaneously. Without Smithers, Burns would miss a dose. Without a dose, Burns would die within a week. Smithers isn't devoted to Burns merely out of complex emotional attachment, though the show establishes that dimension too. He is devoted because he understands, at a practical level, that his absence is a death sentence. He keeps Burns alive through logistics, through calendar management and appointment keeping and the quiet, relentless administrative work of maintaining a man who should by every biological measure be dead. Burns's connection to historical events adds another dimension. The show has depicted Burns referencing or claiming personal involvement in events spanning from the early 20th century through the present. He attended Yale, he served in World War II, he stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during that war and kept it hidden for decades. He knew Howard Hughes. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as something he read about, but as something he experienced directly. His family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution, and the Burns dynasty, the family lineage that he represents and has been extending, goes back centuries. The show has depicted the Burns family as one of the oldest and most consistently powerful lineages in American history. Not just wealthy in the way that a successful industrialist is wealthy, but wealthy in the foundational sense, the kind of wealth that builds infrastructure and then charges everyone else to use it, that shapes the physical and economic landscape of regions, that exists so far above the ordinary mechanisms of accountability that legal consequence becomes theoretical rather than practical. Burns inherited this legacy and has been extending it for over a century. He didn't build an empire. He received one that was already ancient and kept it going, which is in some ways a more extraordinary achievement. And this raises a question the show has never answered. Whether Burns is unique, or whether his family has always found ways to extend the lifespans of its most important members. If the Burns dynasty has maintained continuous control of its fortune for centuries, and if the current Burns has been kept alive through artificial means for well over 100 years, what methods did earlier generations of the family use? Before nuclear radiation, before modern pharmaceutical interventions, before any of the technology that currently keeps Burns functional, did previous holders of the Burns legacy employ some other strategy? The show doesn't say. But it does establish that the family has been in continuous, coherent control of its affairs for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity requires either extraordinary luck or extraordinary measures, and the Burns family has never struck anyone who looks at it closely as the lucky kind. Burns has come closer to death than almost any other major character in the show's history. He's been shot, he's been hospitalized multiple times, he's collapsed, fallen, been poisoned, been abandoned in the wilderness, and every time he comes back. Not through the cartoon resilience that Homer displays. Homer simply endures damage and continues. Burns comes back through infrastructure, through money, through the machinery of wealth that ensures there will always be someone standing by with the resources and the knowledge to restore him. Homer's survival is passive. He persists because the story requires him to persist. Burns's survival is engineered. Every dollar he has ever spent, every institution he has corrupted, every doctor he has retained, every private medical research initiative he has funded, all of it serves one purpose. Keep the treatments coming. Maintain the equilibrium. Keep the reactor running. Because Burns understands, at whatever level of self-awareness the show allows him, that if the system stops, he stops. And empires, properly constructed, don't allow themselves to stop. The thing that stays with you about Burns's continued existence, beyond the strangeness of the medical situation, is the town's dependency on it. Springfield's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns's continued ownership and operation. Burns's survival depends on the treatment infrastructure that his wealth provides. It's a closed system, a loop where the man, the machine, and the money all sustain each other. Springfield cannot effectively challenge Burns because it cannot survive without what Burns provides. And Burns cannot allow himself to die because dying would require the system he built to finally face accounting for what it has done to the people living inside it. He's not immortal. He's something the word immortal doesn't quite capture. He's too expensive to let die. And Springfield has been paying the bill for decades, in the coin of poisoned water and damaged brains, and children born yellow and four-fingered into a contamination zone that the richest man in town keeps running, because keeping it running keeps him alive. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper Springfield's Denial Machine. In September of 1997, an episode aired that the show's fanbase has never fully forgiven. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper. It has been ranked consistently among the worst episodes the show has ever produced. Harry Shearer, who voices both Principal Skinner and Mr. Burns, publicly expressed his displeasure with the storyline. Critics argued that it destroyed Skinner as a character by undermining everything the show had established about him. It is cited repeatedly as the moment the show stopped respecting its own continuity. But here's the argument that takes a little longer to arrive at. The Principal and the Pauper isn't a betrayal of what The Simpsons was. It's a precise and almost brutal articulation of what Springfield has always been. The episode didn't break the show. It diagnosed the town. And once you understand what it's actually diagnosing, every continuity error, every reset, every collective amnesia the show has ever deployed stops looking like lazy writing and starts looking like evidence of the same thing. Here's what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. It's the kind of community celebration that these events tend to be warm, slightly perfunctory, an excuse to put a familiar face at the center of a room full of people who appreciate him without thinking about him too hard. And then a stranger walks in. A man nobody recognizes. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner. The real Seymour Skinner. A decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia, held for years, and eventually escaped, returning home to discover that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner, the principal, Agnes's son, Bart's primary institutional antagonist, is an imposter. His real name is Armand Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a street kid, a petty criminal with no clear future and no particular identity worth preserving. He was drafted. He served in the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian felt the weight of it personally. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news to Skinner's mother, Agnes. Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, a man who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family, never had a home, never had an identity that felt like it belonged to him, simply went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the history, the mother, and he lived inside that stolen identity for 20 years until the real Skinner walked through the door and the whole structure collapsed. Now here's where Springfield does something that should have alarmed the audience much more than it did, because it's the moment the show stops being satire and starts being a confession about the nature of this town. A meeting is called. Both men are present. The truth is fully exposed. Every person in Springfield is informed that their principal is a fraud, that the man who has been running their school and raising Agnes's expectations and competing with Bart for 20 years is not who he said he was. The real Seymour Skinner, the actual man whose name and identity were appropriated, is standing in the room. The evidence is not in dispute. The community has a choice to make. And they vote not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian, not on whether to restore the real Skinner's identity and his rightful place. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict is unanimous. They vote to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree, a formal judicial document declaring that Tamzarian is the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the veteran, the man who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his life stolen, is tied to a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. And the judge explicitly makes it illegal to mention the truth again, under penalty of torture. Let that settle. A community with access to full, documented, witnessed, undeniable proof that a major public figure was operating under a stolen identity voted to preserve the fiction. They exiled the truth. They made it a crime to speak the real name. And they wrote it all down as a legal decree so the denial had official weight. Fans were furious about this episode because they felt it destroyed Skinner, that everything they knew and cared about regarding the character had been rendered false. That 30-plus years of a character's history couldn't survive this revelation. The complaints are understandable, but the episode isn't asking us to abandon Skinner. It's asking us to look at what Springfield actually is. And what Springfield actually is, the episode argues, is a community that has always chosen comfort over truth, that has always voted to maintain the agreed-upon version of reality when the actual version of reality threatens the structures everyone depends on. The principal and the pauper isn't a betrayal of the show's character. It's the show stepping back and showing you the machinery it has been running all along. Think about how many times Springfield has experienced events that should have permanently changed the town's reality. The dome in the movie, the nuclear near misses, the environmental catastrophes, the alien encounters, the time mister, Burns blocked the sun. And every single time, by the next episode, everything is back to normal. Nobody references the previous disaster. Nobody carries the weight of what happened. The slate is wiped clean. The standard explanation is that this is just how television works, especially animated television episodic storytelling with a reset button built into the format. That's a reasonable production explanation, but the principal and the pauper offers something different. It offers the suggestion that Springfield resets not because of format conventions, but because the town chooses to reset, collectively, deliberately, through a social contract that operates just below the surface of every interaction. The contract says, we will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed-upon version of events. We will treat the lie as truth and the truth as a threat. And anyone who breaks this contract, anyone who insists on reality when reality is inconvenient, will be removed. The real Seymour Skinner is Springfield's purest example of this mechanism. He arrived with proof. He showed up with the receipts, with the actual documentation of who he was, with the physical reality of his own face and his own history and his own rightful claim on a name. And the town's response was to tie him to a train. That's not a comedy beat. It's a warning. The show is telling you, in the clearest possible terms, how Springfield maintains its impossible reality through consensus, through the systematic destruction of anyone whose existence threatens the agreed-upon story, through the formalization of denial, making it not just socially enforced but legally binding. Apply this to everything else. Why does Springfield forget the dome? Because acknowledging the dome means acknowledging the pollution. Acknowledging the pollution means confronting the plant. Confronting the plant means challenging Burns. And challenging Burns means risking the economy. So they forget. They vote to forget. They make remembering dangerous by treating anyone who insists on continuity as a destabilizing element. Why does nobody investigate the skeleton bones in the basement of the power plant? The same reason. Why does nobody follow up on Blinky the three-eyed fish? The same reason. Why does Homer's permanent 5% brain damage get laughed off in his hospital room and never referenced again? The same reason. Springfield doesn't forget because its residents are incapable of remembering. They forget because remembering requires a kind of courage, the courage to keep pulling at a thread when you know where it leads, when you know that following it all the way means confronting something that the people in power have spent decades and considerable resources keeping buried. Most people, in most places, choose the version of events that allows them to go home and sleep comfortably. Springfield just does this more completely, more formally, with legal decrees and railroad cars, and the occasional exile of anyone inconveniently committed to accuracy. And if the coma theory is sitting in the back of your mind as you consider all of this as it should be, since we've just spent a section establishing it, then the principal and the pauper takes on an additional dimension that is almost unbearably melancholy. If everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented a scenario in which an entire community votes to sustain a false identity because the dreaming mind needs to believe this is possible. Homer needs to believe that lies can be maintained through collective agreement. He needs to believe that a stolen life can become real if enough people choose to treat it as real. Because that's what Homer's coma is. A stolen life masquerading as a lived one, a dream pretending to be waking experience. And as long as Springfield keeps voting to maintain the fiction, as long as the town keeps agreeing that Armin Tamzarian is Seymour Skinner and that everything is fine, Homer never has to confront the truth that he's been dreaming. The real Seymour Skinner is out there somewhere, tied to a train car, moving away from the life that should have been his. He's the last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal, and Springfield has already forgotten him. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the smartest person in Springfield. Maggie Simpson doesn't talk. She communicates primarily through her pacifier, through the direction of her gaze, through a physical vocabulary of gesture and expression that the people around her consistently underestimate. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She cannot reliably walk without assistance. By every external indicator, she is an infant dependent, pre-verbal, incapable of independent action in any meaningful sense. And in that time, without saying a word, she has accomplished more than any other member of her family. She shot a man possibly one of the most powerful men in the country, though we've already examined the complexity of that claim. She led a rebellion in a daycare facility, organizing other babies against an authoritarian caretaker in a way that required planning, communication, and the ability to inspire coordinated action in a group that had no shared language. She has saved her family from life-threatening situations on multiple occasions, moving with a decisiveness and competence that her age makes impossible to explain through any normal developmental framework. She has been tested and found to possess intelligence that sits well outside the range of what standardized assessment tools are designed to measure. And through every remarkable thing she has ever done, she has maintained perfect silence. She has given nobody any reason to look at her more carefully. She has performed the role of a normal baby with such commitment and consistency that the people who should be watching her most closely, her parents, her siblings, the community around her, consistently look right past her to whatever louder thing is happening nearby. Let's start with the shooting, not to relitigate who actually fired the gun, but to look at what came after it. A baby was identified as the person responsible for shooting the richest and most powerful man in town. An investigation was conducted. Evidence was examined. And the official conclusion was that yes, this infant had committed an act of violence against a grown man, and there was nothing that could be done about it. Chief Wiggum said it himself, no jury would convict a baby. The investigation closed. Springfield moved on. And in the final shot of that episode, after everyone else has left the room, Maggie confirms that she understands exactly what happened and exactly what it means to have done it. She checks her surroundings with a deliberateness that isn't reflexive baby behavior. She looks left, looks right, confirms she's alone. And then she performs a motion that mimics pulling a trigger, her pacifier moving in a way that precisely references the act she's been credited with. That sequence, the environmental check, the confirmation of privacy, the controlled reenactment, requires a specific set of cognitive capacities that one-year-olds don't have. It requires situational awareness, which means understanding the relationship between observed behavior and social consequence. It requires memory, which means retaining the specific details of what happened in enough detail to reproduce them accurately. It requires impulse control, which means choosing to perform the gesture in private rather than in front of witnesses. And it requires caution, which means recognizing that performing this gesture in front of others would be disadvantageous. These are not infant cognitions. They are the cognitions of someone who is tracking their own situation with a sophistication that should not be possible given their developmental stage. In 2012, a theatrical short film was released in cinemas before Ice Age, Continental Drift. It was called The Longest Daycare. 7 minutes of Maggie Simpson demonstrating cognitive and strategic capability that would be impressive in an adult and is almost inexplicable in a pre-verbal baby. The premise: Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare center run with institutional authority. She encounters a caterpillar about to become a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Another baby Gerald, a recurring antagonist, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action film in which Maggie reads her environment, identifies the relevant threats, develops a strategy to address them, improvises when that strategy runs into obstacles, executes a multi-step plan that requires precise timing and spatial reasoning, and successfully protects the caterpillar and releases the butterfly, all without speaking a word, and all while operating in a body with the motor capabilities of a 1-year-old. She falls. She stumbles. She crawls when she needs to run. Her physical development is a limitation that she works around constantly, compensating with decision-making that never makes an error. Every choice she makes in those 7 minutes is the correct one. The film earned an Academy Award nomination. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly on various occasions. The results vary by episode because the show uses her IQ as a gag rather than a consistent fact. But the consistent implication across those tests and across her behavior throughout the series is that Maggie's intelligence registers as extraordinary, off the charts. Beyond the useful range of standardized measurement, the show plays this for quick laughs and then the episode moves on to whatever Homer is doing. But the pattern is there, episode after episode, season after season. Now here's the theory, the one that gives Maggie's silence a strategic dimension rather than a developmental one. Maggie has watched Lisa for her entire life. She was born into a household that contains Lisa Simpson, a girl of genuine, remarkable intelligence who uses that intelligence visibly, who announces herself as the smartest person in the room, who argues, challenges, advocates, petitions, and speaks up. Lisa uses her intelligence as a tool and also as an identity, and the result has been consistent. Lisa is dismissed. Lisa is mocked. Lisa is dismissed by adults who should know better, underestimated by the community around her, and repeatedly frustrated by the experience of being right about things in a town that doesn't reward being right about things. Maggie has been watching this happen. From infancy, she has witnessed, with what we now understand to be an extremely functional and attentive mind, the systematic experience of a brilliant person being made to feel that brilliance is a burden rather than an asset. She has watched her sister fight for recognition and receive resistance, propose solutions and be ignored, and keep fighting regardless because that's who Lisa is, someone who can't not engage, can't not speak, can't not try. And Maggie, watching all of this, arrived at a different conclusion. The opposite conclusion. Silence is power, invisibility is protection. The less they notice you, the more you can accomplish. The more they underestimate you, the more freedom you have to act without interference. Think about everything Maggie has done in the show's run. The shooting, the daycare rebellion, the numerous rescues of family members. The problem solving. Every single one of these actions happened below the radar. Nobody was watching closely enough to see her coming. Nobody suspected the baby. Nobody monitored the infants closely enough to notice they were organizing. Nobody thought to include Maggie in an investigation because nobody ever considers that a 1-year-old needs to be included in an investigation. Maggie has designed her own cover. She performs the role of a dependent infant with such thoroughness that the performance itself becomes her primary source of operational freedom. She can do remarkable things precisely because nobody expects a baby to do remarkable things. Now connect this to the radiation theory. If the contaminated environment of Springfield affects different people in different ways, if exposure to the same nuclear material can produce wildly varying outcomes depending on individual biology, then Maggie and Homer represent two extreme ends of the same spectrum. Homer's mutation degraded his intelligence to a level that qualifies as clinical disability. Maggie's mutation, if we're applying the same framework, went in the opposite direction entirely. The radiation amplified something in her. Her intelligence was pushed far beyond the normal range, the way that some radiation-induced mutations in biology produce organisms with dramatically enhanced characteristics alongside the harmful ones. Same family, same house, same contaminated water, same irradiated air. But where the father's brain was diminished, the daughter's was enhanced to a degree the show has never fully reckoned with. Homer and Maggie are two sides of the same radioactive coin. He is what happens when mutation takes something away. She is what happens when it gives something extraordinary. And if the coma theory is correct, if Homer has been unconscious since April of 1993, and everything since then is the dream of a man lying in a hospital bed, then Maggie's extraordinary capability takes on a different kind of emotional weight. Homer cannot watch Maggie grow up. He can't be there for her first real steps, her first words, the developmental milestones of her childhood and adolescence and adulthood that he's missing in the real world, while the dream cycles through its endless loops. He doesn't know who she becomes. He doesn't know whether she's okay. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that exceeds her age, capabilities that ensure her safety regardless of his presence or absence, a competence that guarantees she doesn't need him there to be all right. Her genius in the dream isn't a mutation. It's a father's prayer for a child he can't protect from a hospital bed. It's the mind of a man who loves his daughter desperately and can't be with her manufacturing the thing he most needs to believe that she'll be fine without him. That she's more than fine. That she is, quietly, the most capable person in any room she occupies. Back in the waking world, though, back in Springfield with or without comas or dreams or radiation theories, the darker reading of Maggie's silence is this. She doesn't speak because she's learned that speaking in Springfield gets you nothing. She doesn't reveal what she is because what she is isn't valued in this town. She watches, she accumulates. She understands, probably with a clarity that nobody around her shares, exactly what is wrong with Springfield and exactly who is responsible for it and exactly what would have to happen for any of it to change. And she waits. For what? The show doesn't tell us. Maggie's endgame is the one truly open mystery in this family. She's the only Simpson whose future is completely unwritten because the show has never definitively shown us what she's actually capable of when she chooses to deploy it fully. We've seen glimpses, the shooting, the daycare, the rescues, the silent confirmations and negations that the family trusts more than they probably realize. But glimpses aren't the full picture. Somewhere behind that pacifier, something is thinking. Something has been watching Springfield for 36 years, with an intelligence that nobody suspects and an patience that nobody could sustain without extraordinary motivation. Something is waiting for the right moment. Something knows things about this town that the town has worked very hard to make sure nobody knows. When Maggie finally decides to really act, not just the background heroics that the family absorbs without understanding Springfield will not see it coming. She has spent 3 decades making absolutely sure of that. Section 7. The Simpsons predictions, how they actually work. Let's talk about the predictions. The phenomenon that has made The Simpsons more widely discussed in the 2020s than it was during its acclaimed golden era in the 1990s. The idea that a cartoon created in 1989 has been accurately forecasting specific world events for over 35 years. You've seen the screenshots. You've probably shared some of them. You know the famous ones? In the year 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson had become the first female president of the United States. In that episode, her predecessor, the person she followed into the Oval Office, was identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the 2016 election. 16 years. The show used a Trump presidency as a joke about the absurd direction American celebrity culture and politics were heading, and then American politics headed exactly in that direction, on the schedule you'd need if you wanted to maximize the sense that something uncanny had happened. The internet lost its collective mind. Screenshots from the episode spread everywhere. People who had barely thought about The Simpsons in years suddenly wanted to know, how did they know? Are the writers time travelers? Is there some deeper intelligence operating here? Something that shouldn't be possible within the normal rules of creative production? And then the list only got longer. In 1995, the show depicted a device that looks strikingly similar to what we now call a smartwatch. In 1994, Homer goes to space alongside Buzz Aldrin decades before commercial space tourism became a realistic prospect for private citizens. In 1998, Homer discovers a mathematical equation on a chalkboard that has been analyzed by actual physicists as a reasonably close approximation to a formula that could predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which wasn't experimentally confirmed until 2012. In 1999, Homer proposes a theory suggesting that the universe might be shaped like a donut, and years later, cosmological researchers studying radiation patterns propose that the universe might actually have a toroidal shape. In 1993, an episode depicted a flu virus originating from Asia spreading to Springfield, causing mass panic, supply shortages, and a frantic search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before COVID. 19. During the chaos of that fictional outbreak, Springfield residents accidentally released a swarm of killer bees which felt absurdly prophetic when Asian giant hornets, named murder hornets by the media, appeared in the United States during the actual pandemic of 2020. In 1996, an episode featured a joke in which the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally books the London Symphony Orchestra to perform with them, apparently due to a miscommunication. That specific collaboration, Cypress Hill, with the London Symphony Orchestra actually happened in 2024 at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the event it apparently described in advance. In 1998, the show depicted the Walt Disney Company acquiring 20th Century Fox. Disney actually purchased Fox in 2019. The show was, at the time of that prediction, a Fox property. The writers were essentially predicting that their own parent company would be absorbed by its biggest competitor. The list extends much further than this, and every time a new apparent confirmation arrives, the same question rises again. How are they doing this? The answer from inside the show is resolutely unromantic. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer since the early seasons, has addressed this directly and consistently. His explanation is simple. If you throw enough darts, you're going to hit some bullseyes. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, was even more direct. Most of what looks like prediction, he said, is coincidence because the episodes are old and history has a way of repeating itself. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, references, satirical observations, and extrapolations about American culture, technology, politics, and social dynamics. When you generate that volume of content over that length of time, some portion of it is going to align with future events through pure statistical probability. The mathematics of coincidence, operating at sufficient scale, can produce what looks like prescience. Fact-checking organizations have worked through many of the most widely shared claimed predictions systematically, and the conclusion, in most cases, is that the evidence for genuine prediction doesn't hold up when examined carefully. Many of the supposed predictions reflect trends that were already clearly visible when the episodes were written. The writers didn't predict Trump's presidency. Out of nowhere, they observed that Trump had been publicly discussing running for president since at least the late 1980s and wrote a joke extrapolating the logical conclusion of a celebrity industrial complex that was already well underway. They didn't predict the Disney-Fox merger from nothing. They observed that media consolidation was an accelerating structural trend and wrote a satirical exaggeration of where that trend was heading. They didn't invent the smartwatch. Wrist-mounted computing devices had been a staple of science fiction for decades, and the extrapolation to a consumer version required no particular insight beyond paying attention to where technology was already going. The Simpsons writing staff, historically, has been among the most credentialed in American television. Multiple writers have held degrees from Harvard, Yale, and comparable institutions. A significant portion have backgrounds in mathematics, computer science, physics, political science, or philosophy. These are highly educated people who spend their professional lives studying American culture, analyzing trends, and asking what happens if you follow a current trajectory to its logical or illogical extreme. They're not guessing. They're reading the present more carefully than most people do and then pushing it forward a few steps. And yet, even after acknowledging all of this, even after accepting the statistical argument and the trend reading argument and the confirmation bias argument, there are specific instances where the coincidence feels genuinely strange, where the detail is specific enough, where the alignment is close enough, that the word coincidence starts to feel like it's doing too much work. The Trump prediction didn't just identify a celebrity who might run for president. It specified this particular celebrity in this particular political moment. The episode showed a Trump figure descending an escalator, which mirrors the announcement Trump made in 2015 with a specificity that takes a moment to absorb. The Siegfried and Roy episode didn't just joke about exotic animals being dangerous. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers during a live show, which is almost exactly what happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers during a performance in Las Vegas. These are the ones that don't fully dissolve under the statistical argument. These are the ones that require something additional to explain. And this is where the most interesting interpretation of the predictions emerges, one that requires neither time travel nor conspiracy, just a clear view of what The Simpsons actually is within American culture. The Simpsons doesn't predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it, not through magic, not through some supernatural connection between the writer's room and the flow of events, but through cultural influence, the kind that operates slowly, structurally, at the level of collective imagination, rather than individual decision. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most referenced pieces of American media in history. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its jokes have entered the language. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand their own culture and their own institutions. When the show makes a joke, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream and circulates. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point. It becomes something people bring up in conversation, share on social media, think about when a real-world situation reminds them of it. The show didn't predict Trump becoming president. The show made the idea of Trump becoming president feel like something that had already been considered. It made the outcome feel familiar before it arrived. It primed the cultural imagination so that when the moment came, the response wasn't, "This is impossible," but something closer to, "Of course we've seen this." The joke becomes the frame through which the event is understood when it finally occurs. The show didn't predict the Disney-Fox merger in the sense of foreseeing an unlikely event. It depicted the merger as an obvious satirical exaggeration of trends that were already in motion. When Disney actually bought Fox, the cultural response was recognition rather than shock. Of course they did. The Simpsons told us this would happen years ago. The show's satire hadn't forecasted a future event. It had made that event feel inevitable by presenting it as an accomplished fact in the realm of fiction, so that when the fact arrived in the realm of reality, it felt like confirmation of something already known. This is how cultural influence of this scale operates. Springfield isn't a mirror reflecting America back at itself. America has become Springfield. We've been staring at that mirror for 36 years and we've started to resemble what we see. The corrupt billionaire, the incompetent government, the working-class family too exhausted and too distracted to notice how comprehensively they're being exploited. The endless cycle of catastrophe and reset. The collective amnesia that allows the same mistakes to happen in the same ways for generation after generation. These aren't predictions of where America was heading. They're diagnoses of where America already was when the show first aired. The show just wrote it down first. The predictions that failed, the ones that didn't come true, receive no attention. Nobody screenshots the 1994 episode, where Homer used a technology that doesn't exist. Nobody tracks the political predictions that went the other way. Nobody builds a theory around the cultural shifts that the show anticipated and that didn't materialize. Confirmation bias is a powerful force, and it only works in one direction. We collect the hits and discard the misses. We share the clips that align with current events and scroll past the ones that describe a world we never ended up in. Filtered through the most powerful confirmation bias engine ever created, the internet, where anything that strikes someone as remarkable will be shared, regardless of whether the broader pattern supports the impression. 800 episodes of satirical commentary about American life produces a highlight reel that looks at a glance like prophecy. The predictions aren't supernatural. They're the natural result of a brilliantly constructed show running for an implausibly long time, staffed by people who pay extremely close attention to the world they're describing, producing more satirical content than any comparable program in television history, and then having that content filtered through an audience and a culture that has been shaped by the show's own observations for over 3 decades. The Simpsons wrote enough possible futures that some of them were guaranteed to arrive. The ones that arrived are the only ones anyone remembers. And even knowing all of that, even understanding the mechanism completely when the next clip surfaces from 1998 that lines up with a 2025 headline, there's still something that makes you pause for a second. Maybe that pause is the point. Maybe the real prediction was always about us, about the kind of species that would keep watching, keep comparing, keep looking for patterns in the noise, and keep finding them. The Simpsons didn't predict the future. It predicted that we'd spend a very long time convinced it had. Sectiniat. Mona Simpson and the Burns Conspiracy. There is a character who explains almost everything important about Homer Simpson. She appears in only a handful of episodes. She has been absent from Springfield for most of Homer's life and for most of the show's run. She is, by almost any measure, the most important character in the series. The one whose presence or absence determines the shape of Homer's entire emotional landscape, and the conspiracy that connects her disappearance to Mr. Burns and to the fundamental damage at the center of the Simpson family is one of the show's most carefully constructed long-term storylines. Her name is Mona Simpson. She is Homer's mother. And she didn't die. For the first 6 seasons of the show, Homer's mother was presented as dead. That was the official story, the one Abe gave Homer when Homer was young, the one supported by a headstone, the one that shaped Homer's understanding of his own childhood and his own worth. Homer grew up believing he was a boy whose mother had died when he was little. He grew up carrying the particular grief that comes from a loss that can never be argued with or explained or made to make sense, just a fact, heavy and permanent, that his mother was gone. This belief shaped everything about Homer. His desperate need for approval, his terror of abandonment, his willingness to absorb humiliation and degradation from Burns rather than risk losing the stability of his job, his clingy, overwhelming love for Marge, a love that is real and genuine but that also carries the weight of someone who has been afraid of being left since childhood and has never fully stopped being afraid. Homer's entire emotional architecture is a response to a grief that, as it turns out, was constructed on a lie. In Season 7, the episode Mother Simpson revealed what actually happened. Homer fakes his own death to get out of Saturday work, very Homer. And when Marge makes him go to the Hall of Records to correct the error, he finds that according to municipal records, his mother is alive. The grave Abe showed him years ago was the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been using a famous writer's headstone to represent his wife's burial for Homer's entire life. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave. She doesn't recognize him at first. He's grown into a person she never got to meet. When the recognition comes, when the reunion happens, it is one of the most genuinely emotional scenes the show has produced in its entire run. And then Mona tells him the truth about why she left. The story goes back to 1969. Mona was a housewife. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer. She was living a quiet life in Springfield while the world outside was going through one of its most turbulent periods, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam protests, the counterculture, and something shifted in her. The show depicts it with characteristic absurdity but genuine emotional weight. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists, people the show describes as hippies, but whose cause, the show is careful to establish, was legitimate. They targeted a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let that settle for a moment. Mr. Burns didn't just own a nuclear power plant with 342 violations. He owned a germ warfare facility, a laboratory designed to produce biological weapons, in Springfield. In the same town where Homer Simpson was growing up, where children were playing in the parks, where families were going about their lives without any idea that the richest man in town was manufacturing weaponized pathogens down the road. Mona and her group broke into the laboratory. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agent stored inside. During the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, a man named Clancy Wiggum, who would later become Springfield's chief of police. The raid was successful. The weapons were destroyed, and Mona made one mistake. As the group fled, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos. That someone was Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a federal fugitive. She couldn't go home. She couldn't contact Abe. She couldn't hold Homer or explain to him why she was disappearing. She kissed him goodbye while he slept and walked out into the night, and she didn't come back for 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead. And Homer spent the next 3 decades believing that he was the kind of son a mother would leave, believing that there was something wrong with him, something that made love unreliable, something that meant the people who should be permanent would always eventually go. That belief, that particular damage, is the source of almost everything fragile in Homer's emotional life. Burns didn't just identify Mona to the FBI. He pursued her. He maintained the grudge. When Mona returns to Springfield in the Season 7 episode, Burns spots her through a cab window and calls the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer says goodbye to his mother for the second time. This time knowing what happened. This time knowing who made it happen. And who made it happen was his employer. Homer works for the man who destroyed his family. He earns his paycheck from the man who stole his mother. He has worked for this man for his entire adult life. And the show depicts with quiet devastation the fact that Homer doesn't connect these dots in any complete way. He doesn't confront Burns. He doesn't quit. He doesn't stop showing up at the plant each morning and fumbling through another day in Sector 7G for a man who, by any measure of justice, owes Homer something that cannot be repaid. Homer's failure to make this connection isn't played as comedy. It's played as tragedy. Because Homer's brain, degraded by the crayon, degraded by decades of radiation, degraded by whatever combination of biological damage Springfield has inflicted on him, doesn't work in the way that would allow him to draw lines between things that happened decades apart. The architecture of his suffering is invisible to him. He lives inside it without being able to see it. And here's the most disturbing layer of the conspiracy. Burns didn't just ruin Mona's life. He engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was a child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally compromised, hungry for approval, afraid of abandonment, grateful for whatever stability was on offer, incapable of effective resistance to authority. The perfect employee. The ideal occupant of a Sector 7G safety inspector role that requires incompetence, compliance, and a very low probability of noticing anything that should be noticed. Homer doesn't work at the power plant because he's too unintelligent to find better employment, though the show often frames it that way for comedy. Homer works at the power plant because Burns broke him before he was old enough to defend himself. And the broken version of Homer is exactly the version Burns needs. The show confirms the full architecture of this arrangement later, through a revelation about Grandpa Simpson. Burns had committed a crime. The show is characteristically vague about the specifics, and Grandpa discovered it. The leverage changed hands momentarily, and Burns, who never lets leverage remain in someone else's hands for long, struck a deal. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would always have a job at the plant. Not just for now, permanently. However incompetent he became, however many safety violations he missed, however many documented errors accumulated in his file, Homer Simpson would never be permanently dismissed. The deal protected him. It also imprisoned him. Homer's guaranteed employment at the nuclear plant isn't a cartoon convenience or a running gag that the writers forgot to resolve. It's a contractual obligation brokered between Grandpa Simpson and the man who destroyed his family, agreed to in secret, maintained for decades, and never explained to Homer because explaining it would require explaining everything else. Homer's mother was a radical who fought against a billionaire's biological weapons program. The billionaire retaliated by destroying her family. Her husband cut a deal with the man who took his wife away. Her son grew up believing he was unloved, became cognitively damaged through a combination of factors that include environmental poisoning and physical brain damage, and spent his entire adult life working for the man who made all of it happen. 3 generations of one family broken by one man's grudge. And Homer stands at the center of it, too damaged to see the pattern, too dependent to break free from it, too lost in the fog of his own accumulated damage to understand why his life has always felt heavier than it should. The show proved what Homer might have been. In that season 12 episode, when the crayon was removed, Homer became articulate and thoughtful, and capable of understanding his world with a precision that had never previously been available to him. He saw Springfield clearly. He saw his situation clearly. The man who could have existed, the man who would have existed if Burns hadn't intervened when Homer was 6 years old and his mother vanished in the night that man was briefly present. And then Homer had the crayon put back, because being smart in Springfield was unbearable. The clarity was too expensive, but the choice was never really free. Homer was never meant to be functional in Springfield. Burns made sure of that before Homer was old enough to know it was happening. Mona Simpson died in a later season. The scene is one of the show's quietest and most devastating moments. Homer sits with her. He holds her hand. He watches his mother slip away for the last time, with the weight of 27 stolen years between them and no way to recover any of it. No joke, no reset. Just a man and the mother he barely knew, and the space between what happened and what should have happened, which was enormous and unbridgeable. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath the jokes, underneath 36 seasons of Homer falling and getting back up and Bart getting in trouble and Lisa fighting for something and Maggie watching everything, there is a story about a family that was systematically destroyed by one man's power and one town's inability to resist it. Mona fought back and lost everything. Abe made a deal with the enemy and buried the truth. Homer inherited the consequences and never understood their source. Burns won. Burns always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules. And the rules say Homer Simpson will work at the power plant indefinitely because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a choice, because the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G. And Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Section 9. Where is Springfield? Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people could locate Springfield on an emotional map than could name the capital of half the actual states in the country. It has a nuclear power plant, and a gorge, and a harbor, and a monorail, and a lemon tree, and a tire fire that has been burning for years. It has an elementary school, a prison, 2 hospitals, a quickie mart, a bar, a bowling alley, and a town hall that has burned down at least once. It has a main street and a suburb and an industrial district, and somewhere in the approximate vicinity of all of this, a patch of woods where Burns wanders after his weekly treatments. But where is it? The show has been asked this question for 36 years and has managed to make the asking feel more interesting than any answer could possibly be. Every clue that seems to narrow the geography down is eventually contradicted by a different clue in a different episode. Springfield has mountains nearby and also ocean access and also desert landscapes within apparent driving distance, and also farmland and forests, and what appears to be at various points a Canadian border and a Mexican one. It borders, depending on which episode you're watching, Ohio, Nevada, Maine, Kentucky, and possibly somewhere in between all of them at once. Springfield exists in what should be a specific American geography. It has a climate, an ecology, a regional character. But every time you try to pin that down, the show gently and then less gently pulls the specificity away and replaces it with something contradictory. Matt Groening, the show's creator, has admitted that he named the town Springfield because it's one of the most common city names in America. There are Springfields in nearly every state, and because he grew up near Springfield, Oregon. He stated this in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine, and for approximately 48 hours, the mystery appeared to be solved. Springfield was in Oregon. The show was set in the Pacific Northwest. People made arguments about climate and geography and vegetation that seemed to support this, and then the show continued to contradict it. Episodes aired after that interview that placed Springfield's geography in contexts inconsistent with Oregon. The writers kept the mystery alive because the writers understood something that the creator's confession didn't resolve. The mystery is the point. The answer was always less valuable than the question. Here's what Springfield's impossible geography actually accomplishes. A town that can be located nowhere specifically is a town that can be located everywhere generally. Springfield has oceanfront property and mountain ranges and desert landscapes and active volcanoes all within apparent driving range because Springfield is built from every American geography at once. It is the architectural Frankenstein of the American imagination stitched together from the Rust Belt's industrial decay and the Sun Belt's suburban sprawl, and New England's small-town insularity and the Midwest's cultural blankness, and the West's sense of space. It's everywhere. It's the town you grew up in, regardless of which town that actually was. The show resonates with audiences across the entire country because every American audience finds something that feels like their home in Springfield, and that's only possible because Springfield was deliberately designed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. This is the intentional explanation, and it's true as far as it goes. But the theories we've been exploring suggest something additional. If the radiation theory holds, if Springfield is a contamination zone where the normal rules of biology have been bent by decades of nuclear exposure, why should geography be exempt? The people of Springfield have 4 fingers and yellow skin and don't age. The animals have extra eyes. The water is toxic. If the physical reality of living organisms can be warped by what's in the air and the soil and the water, why couldn't the physical landscape itself be warped as well? Maybe Springfield has both mountains and ocean access, because the contamination doesn't just affect biology. Maybe it affects the spatial relationship between things. Maybe decades of radiation have done something to the geography of Springfield that makes it non-Euclidean in a very practical sense that has compressed or distorted the distances between places in a way that shouldn't be possible in normal geography. This sounds extreme. But the show has established that essentially everything else about Springfield operates outside normal parameters. The spatial impossibility of the geography may just be one more symptom of the same underlying cause. The coma theory offers a different and more emotionally resonant explanation. Homer's dreaming mind doesn't have a precise, coherent, internal map of American geography. What it has is impressions, fragments from every place he ever visited or drove through or saw on television. Mountains from a family vacation, ocean from a commercial he half-watched, desert from a film, Midwest farmland from a road trip. His unconscious mind assembled Springfield from all of these fragments, layering them on top of each other without regard for the geographic logic that would prevent them from coexisting in a single location. Because dreams don't have geographic logic, dreams have emotional logic. The places in dreams are where they need to be for the story that the dreaming mind is telling, not where they need to be on a map. Springfield feels like America because it's made from Homer's memory of America. And Homer's memory of America, like most people's memory of most things, is scattered and associative and held together by feeling rather than fact. The principle and the pauper theory adds yet another dimension. If Springfield is a community that operates through collective denial, that maintains its reality through consensus rather than evidence, that makes inconvenient truths illegal and exiles the people who carry them, then the town's geographic uncertainty is the ultimate expression of that denial in its most sophisticated form. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. You cannot bring legal accountability to a nuclear facility if the state it's located in keeps changing. You cannot hold anyone responsible for anything if the jurisdiction is perpetually undefined. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means accountability. Landing means someone shows up with a proper address and a search warrant and starts asking questions about the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the human skeletons in the basement. As long as Springfield's location remains contested, as long as the show keeps contradicting any definitive answer, the town exists in a kind of legal fog that makes it immune to the kind of external scrutiny that might otherwise force the truth into the open. The show gave you the truth once, even. In the 12th season mockumentary Behind the Laughter, Springfield's location was finally stated explicitly. In the original broadcast, the family was said to be from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed to a different state. The answer literally changed depending on which version of the episode you were watching. The show gave you a definitive answer and then made it not definitive by making the definitive answer unstable. Even when Springfield has a location, that location isn't permanent. It shifts, it mutates, it refuses to stay fixed. Every state in the Union has been theorized as Springfield's home. Every theory has evidence, and every theory has contradictions. The show has maintained this state of permanent geographic ambiguity for longer than most of its viewers have been alive, and it has done so not because the writers couldn't decide, but because they decided very early that deciding was less interesting than not deciding. Springfield will never be located, not because the answer doesn't exist, but because the mystery is more useful than the answer. A town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone. A town that belongs to everyone is a town that can't be shut down, can't be regulated by a specific jurisdiction, can't be forced to answer for itself in any specific court of law. Springfield floats. And in a show about a town that can never face the truth of what it is, floating is the most honest thing Springfield has ever done. Section 10. The Floating Timeline. Why Nobody Ages. Bart Simpson was 10 years old in 1989. He is 10 years old now. Lisa was 8. She is 8. Maggie was 1. She is 1. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. They still are. 36 years have passed in the world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The television industry has a term for this, a floating timeline. The present is always the present. The characters live in whatever year it currently is when the episode airs, with the technology and the cultural references and the political landscape of that year, but the characters themselves don't age within it. They remain at their established ages regardless of how many years the show runs. Most animated series do some version of this, and for most shows that run for 4 or 5 seasons, the floating timeline is invisible. The gap between when the show started and when it ends isn't wide enough for the implication to accumulate. The Simpsons has been running for 36 years. The floating timeline has become visible in a way that creates strange effects. The most obvious is with Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their history was grounded in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school during a period with specific cultural markers, specific music, specific fashion, specific reference points that would make sense for people who were teenagers in that era. Homer's hair, Marge's prom dress, the whole thing felt coherent. But as the floating present dragged forward, the backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are in their mid-30s in 2025, they didn't meet in high school in 1980. They met in approximately 2005. Their formative years weren't defined by Vietnam and disco, but by social media's early emergence and the shift in how young people communicated with each other. The show has actually depicted this shift in later flashback episodes. Homer and Marge's youth has been rewritten multiple times. They were briefly hippies, then grunge fans, then something adjacent to hipsters. Their love story is the same, their personalities are the same, but the era keeps sliding forward to accommodate the mathematics of a timeline that won't age them. They don't have a fixed past. Their history is a draft that gets revised every few years to maintain the illusion of a permanent present. Their memories are unstable. Their origin story is whatever the current episode needs it to be. Every theory we've discussed tonight converges on this point. They all arrive at the same problem: the frozen characters, the non-aging children, the perpetual present through different routes, and they all offer a different explanation for the same impossibility. The coma theory. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went to sleep in April of 1993. His children are the ages they were when the vending machine fell. His wife is the person she was on that day. The world of the dream doesn't receive new information. It runs on the last data it had before the system went offline. The radiation theory. Nobody ages because their biology has been fundamentally altered at the cellular level by chronic exposure to nuclear contamination. The mutations have changed the basic rules of aging for everyone in the contamination zone. Normal senescence, The biological process by which cells deteriorate and organisms grow old doesn't operate the same way in Springfield because the radiation has rewritten the instructions. The denial theory, the lesson of the principal and the pauper. Nobody ages because Springfield collectively agrees not to acknowledge the passage of time when acknowledging it would require confronting uncomfortable truths. If Bart turned 11, the logic would eventually require confronting the fact that he should be 46 by now. If Lisa turned 9, the math would eventually surface. The community agreement to treat the characters as eternally the ages they began makes this specific inconvenient truth, like all inconvenient truths in Springfield, something that simply isn't acknowledged. The Burns immortality theory introduces the possibility that aging itself is negotiable in this universe. Burns has been alive for well over a century through artificial means. If one person in Springfield can negotiate with death through sufficient wealth and medical infrastructure, the concept of mandatory biological aging has already been demonstrated to be conditional rather than absolute. All of these theories say the same thing in different languages. Time doesn't work in Springfield. Something, whether it's radiation, or a comatose man's dreaming mind, or collective denial, or the machinations of an extremely wealthy person who has arranged his environment to suit his preferences, has broken the normal relationship between time and biological experience for everyone who lives in this town. The show has imagined its characters aging. It's done it more than once, with genuine emotional care. In Season 6, an episode called Lisa's Wedding flashes forward to show Lisa as a young woman about to be married. The episode is thoughtful and detailed and emotionally rich. Lisa is who the show has always suggested she would become: intelligent, principled, searching, a little lonely, trying to build connection in a world that doesn't quite match her expectations. The episode proves that the show's writers can envision these characters as adults. They can tell stories about who they'd be if time were allowed to move. But the flash forward closes. Lisa returns to 8, Bart returns to 10. The window shuts and the permanent present resumes as if the glimpse never happened. The show can imagine growth. It chooses not to allow it. And this distinction between being capable of something and choosing not to do it tells you something important about what the floating timeline actually is. It's a decision, not a limitation. The show knows these characters could age. It chooses to prevent that aging because allowing it would change what the show is at a fundamental level. This is where the mystery becomes something larger than one television series. Because the floating timeline isn't just a production choice made for narrative convenience. It's a statement, a thesis about what this family represents and what that representation requires. The Simpsons is the American family. Not a reflection of the American family in the way that many family shows have been, as a snapshot of a specific moment in cultural history. The Simpsons is the American family in the sense that it has been continuously, persistently present in American cultural life for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. It outlasted every other family. It outlasted the Huxtables and the Keatons and the Bunkers and every other household that television built and then let go. The Simpsons endured. And the American family, as The Simpsons depicts, it cannot age. Homer must always be middle-aged. Marge must always be patient. Bart must always be rebellious. Lisa must always be idealistic and isolated. Maggie must always be silent and watching. The dynamic must be preserved. The structure must hold. Because the moment the Simpson family ages, the moment Bart goes to college and Lisa moves away, and Maggie finally speaks and Homer retires and Marge is left in a quieter house on Evergreen Terrace, the show stops being a comedy. It becomes an elegy. It becomes the story of a family that ran out of time. And that story, while real and true and something television can absolutely tell, is not what we have collectively decided this particular family is for. We built the loop. The audience built it. Or rather, the audience's decades-long relationship with the show built it. Every time we tune in and see Bart still 10 and Lisa still 8, and the couch still in the same place with the same pattern, we participate in the agreement to keep it that way. We're not just watching the show. We're choosing to maintain the fiction. We're voting to keep the timeline floating. We're the town of Springfield, collectively agreeing that this specific truth that time has passed, that these characters should be older, is one we'd prefer not to confront. If they age, the show ends. If the show ends, we have to admit that we are older. That the world we watch the show in whatever couch, whatever kitchen, Whatever childhood bedroom or college dorm room or first apartment is gone. That the Simpsons, frozen at their ages, have been keeping time while we aged around them, and that the gap between when we first saw them and now represents a significant portion of many viewers' lives. As long as Bart is 10, the 90s are still somewhere accessible. As long as Homer is stumbling through the door from the plant at the same time every evening, the idea of the middle-class American family having a viable future isn't entirely foreclosed. As long as the show continues, something continues that we can't quite name but can feel the absence of when it goes away. The loop isn't their prison, it's ours. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every week to confirm that the walls are still standing and the family is still intact. And every time we watch, every time we recognize a line from an episode that aired before many of us were born, we make the loop a little tighter, a little harder to exit. Because if it exits, if the timeline finally stops floating and starts landing, then Bart turns 11, and Lisa turns 9, and Maggie finally says her second word, and the show ends. And the ending means acknowledging that the version of America The Simpsons represents the chaotic, stubborn, improbably resilient version of the working American family was always temporary, was always one birthday away from becoming something we'd have to mourn rather than something we could return to. The Simpsons don't age because we won't let them. We pressed pause in 1989. We've never pressed play. And here we are, 36 years later, watching the same family in the same house on the same impossible street, waiting for something to change and holding on to the knowledge that it won't, because we have collectively decided that the alternative is too much to hold. Section 11: Hans Moleman's deaths and the darkness behind Ned Flanders. We're nearly at the end of our time in Springfield tonight. The lights are low. The night has gotten quieter around you. Let these last two mysteries settle gently, because one of them is strange in a way that's almost funny, and the other one is strange in a way that stays with you long after you've stopped thinking about it. Let's start with Hans Moleman. If you've watched The Simpsons for any meaningful stretch of time, you know Hans Moleman. He's the small, elderly, almost entirely blind man who appears in the backgrounds of Springfield scenes and exists primarily to suffer in various escalating ways. He gets hit by cars, he gets crushed by falling objects, he gets buried alive, he gets eaten by animals, he gets struck by lightning during what were presumably ordinary moments in his day. He walks into traffic and disappears under wheels. He is, by any reasonable count, the most frequently killed character in the history of American animated television. The show has killed Hans Moleman dozens of times. Not in the Halloween special episodes, where death is part of the premise. Not in dream sequences or alternate universe stories where the normal rules are suspended. In regular canonical episodes, Hans Moleman dies and then he appears in the next episode, completely fine, with no acknowledgement that he was deceased 2 episodes ago. Most fans treat this as a running gag. Moleman dies. He comes back. It's funny, don't think about it. But under the framework of everything we've discussed tonight, Moleman's repeated deaths are genuinely strange. If the radiation theory is correct, Moleman might represent the most extreme mutation in Springfield, a man whose cellular biology has been so completely altered by nuclear exposure that his body can reconstitute itself after fatal trauma. He doesn't survive damage the way Homer survives it. Homer endures injury and heals. Moleman actually dies. His body ceases to function, and then he comes back, as if death in Springfield is a temporary condition for certain residents rather than the permanent one it's supposed to be. A biological reset, a restoration, something in his cellular structure that allows for reconstitution after what would normally be an irreversible end. Through the coma lens, Moleman is a background process in Homer's dream, a minor character that Homer's unconscious mind doesn't allocate consistent resources to. He dies because the dreaming brain occasionally lets secondary characters lapse, they become momentarily inconsistent, their existence flickering, and he comes back because the dream needs population density to feel like a real town. Moleman isn't a person in this reading. He's a prop that the dreaming mind breaks occasionally and then reassembles because the simulation requires him to be present. Through the Springfield denial framework, Moleman's deaths are simply another thing the town has agreed not to notice. A man dies publicly, repeatedly, in front of witnesses, and nobody investigates. Nobody asks the obvious question. Nobody checks in. The community has normalized Molman's death cycle the way it has normalized everything else that should be alarming because acknowledging it would require a kind of attention that Springfield has collectively decided not to pay. Here's the detail that doesn't fit any comfortable reading. Molman once stated his age as 31 years old. Look at him. He appears to be somewhere in his 80s or 90s advanced age written into every visible feature, his physical deterioration dramatic and thorough. If he's telling the truth about his age, and there's no reason within the show to doubt him, something aged him catastrophically. Something took a man who should be in the early middle of his life and produced this, a figure so physically degraded he appears ancient, so fragile that ordinary daily life kills him repeatedly, yet so persistent that death itself keeps releasing him. The radiation theory has an explanation. The denial theory has an explanation. The coma theory has an explanation. What none of them can quite do is make the Molman situation feel settled. He keeps dying. He keeps returning. He told us he was 31. And nobody in Springfield in all the years since has thought to ask the follow-up question. Now, Ned Flanders. On the surface, and the surface is where Ned spends a great deal of his considerable effort, Ned Flanders is everything Homer isn't. He's kind. He's patient to an almost clinical degree. He's devoutly religious in the way that actual religious devotion, as opposed to performed religiosity, tends to look consistent, daily, woven into how he treats people rather than displayed for audiences. He's financially responsible. He's physically fit. He's a good father to Rod and Todd in the ways that matter present, attentive, stable. He's a good neighbor in ways that Homer consistently fails to reciprocate and frequently fails to notice. By any reasonable measure, Ned Flanders is a better man than Homer Simpson in almost every way that can be observed. And the show punishes him for it, continuously, with a thoroughness that starts to feel like something beyond dramatic irony. Ned's wife Maud was killed in a freak accident at the Springfield Speedway. A t-shirt cannon misfired. The shirts hit Maud rather than Homer, who had been dodging them. Homer's reflexive selfishness redirected the projectiles toward her. She died because Homer moved out of the way, and Ned forgave him. He forgave him because Ned forgives, because that's what Ned does, because 30-plus years of conditioning have made forgiveness Ned's primary response to anything that might otherwise produce a different and more proportionate reaction. Fans noticed the cracks in the facade when a hurricane destroyed Ned's house. The community rebuilt it and did such a poor job that it collapsed almost immediately, and Ned snapped. He had a genuine, complete psychological breakdown. He screamed at the town. He named his grievances decades of accumulated frustration and pain and loss, pouring out in a way that was clearly coming from somewhere very deep. He said things he had been holding inside for a very long time, and he said them with a rawness that didn't feel like comedy. He was then institutionalized, committed to a psychiatric facility, and in the facility, it was revealed that Ned's relentless positivity isn't a character trait. It's the result of behavioral conditioning. As a child, Ned was violent and uncontrollable. His parents' beatniks, who opposed conventional discipline on philosophical grounds, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through behavioral modification. The process apparently worked. The violence was suppressed. The rage was buried. And what remained was the Ned Flanders that Springfield knows: patient, generous, kind, and apparently incapable of expressing anything that lives in the same emotional region as anger. This changes everything about Ned, once you know it. His patience with Homer isn't saintly. It's pathological. He can't fully express anger because his nervous system was rewired as a child to suppress it at all costs. His faith isn't entirely spiritual conviction, it's also a framework that he needed to explain why he keeps suffering despite doing everything correctly. His forgiveness of Homer after Maud's death isn't grace in the theological sense. It's the automated response of a system that was programmed, before he had any say in it, to absorb injury and respond with kindness regardless of the circumstances. The show knows this. The show depicted the breakdown. It showed us what's underneath the conditioning. And what's underneath is not something ugly exactly, but something desperate. Something that has been waiting for decades behind the relentless affability for permission to exist. The despair that emerged during the breakdown is bottomless in a way that makes you realize it was always there, always present behind every cheerful okely-dokely, and every gift offered over the fence to a neighbor who barely remembers his name is spelled differently. Ned Flanders is the saddest character in the show, not Homer, who is too cognitively impaired to fully comprehend the architecture of his own suffering. Not Lisa, who is young enough to still believe that sustained effort might produce improvement. Not Burns, who is too powerful to ever be required to experience consequences in any meaningful way. Ned, the man who does everything right and receives nothing for it. The man whose wife was killed by his neighbor's selfishness. The man who forgave because he had no other available response. The man who goes to church every Sunday and prays to a God who, within the show's established continuity, demonstrably exists. God has appeared on the show, has spoken directly to Homer, has offered Homer guidance and reassurance on multiple occasions. God talks to Homer. God has never spoken directly to Ned. The drunk who falls asleep during the sermon gets divine conversation. The devout man who structures his life around his faith, who has dedicated his daily experience to the principles he holds, who has never for a moment treated his religious commitment as anything other than the most serious obligation of his existence, he gets silence. That isn't random cruelty deployed by the writers to make Ned's situation funnier. That's a thesis. The Simpsons is telling you something about how Springfield works, about what gets rewarded and what doesn't in this particular ecosystem. Goodness, the show argues, is not what the system is designed to select for. Compliance is. Ned is the most compliant man in Springfield. He was programmed for compliance before he was old enough to understand what was being done to him. And his reward for the compliance, for the conditioning, for the daily effort of being kind in a place that doesn't particularly value kindness, is a dead wife, a house that collapsed, a neighbor who will never fully appreciate what Ned offers, and a God who speaks to everyone in Springfield except the one person who is consistently, quietly listening for an answer. Homer does everything wrong in a system that doesn't effectively punish wrongness. Ned does everything right in a system that doesn't meaningfully reward rightness. They live next door to each other. They've been neighbors for 36 years. And the gap between them, between the man who tries and the man who doesn't, has never closed. The system isn't designed to close it. The system is designed to keep Homer at the power plant, and Ned at the fence, and Burns at the top of everything, and Molman in the ground, and everyone exactly where they were when the loop started. That's Springfield. Closing the loop stares back. We've spent a long night in Springfield. We've walked through the radiation theory and watched it explain everything from the yellow skin to the 4 fingers to Homer's superhuman resilience. We've followed Homer into the coma and considered what it means if everything since April of 1993 is a love letter written by an unconscious father to the family he can't reach. We've reopened the Burns shooting case and found that the official answer has problems the official account never quite resolves. We've traced Burns's impossible lifespan and the medical infrastructure that keeps him running. We've watched Springfield vote to criminalize truth in a meeting that should have been more alarming than it was played. We've looked at Maggie's silence and found a strategic intelligence that nobody in her family has noticed. We've counted the predictions that came true and understood why the ones that didn't come true don't enter the conversation. We've followed Mona Simpson's trail from a 1,969 raid on a biological weapons laboratory to a graveside reunion decades later and traced the damage Burns left behind through 3 generations. We've looked for Springfield on a map and found it everywhere and nowhere. We've stared at the floating timeline until we saw ourselves in it, the audience that won't let these characters age because letting them age would mean confronting our own. We've sat with Molman's inexplicable deaths and Ned Flanders' inexplicable suffering and understood what each of them represents in the show's quiet accounting of what happens in a place where the rules don't reward what they're supposed to reward. Every theory in this video arrived at the same place through a different door. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural and persistent and old. Whether the mechanism is radiation, or a dream, or collective denial, or the sheer accumulated weight of existing for 36 years in a loop that was never supposed to close something, has broken the normal rules of consequence, and time and memory for everyone who lives there. But here is what stays with me, after all of it. The Simpsons has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. It has produced nearly 800 episodes. It has been analyzed and theorized and discussed and argued over by generations of viewers who cared enough about these characters to dig into what they represent. And through all of that, through every theory and every buried storyline and every canonical contradiction, the show has kept doing one thing consistently, quietly, episode after episode. It has kept bringing Homer home. Whatever the episode is about, however far Homer travels, or how many disasters he causes, or how many impossible things happen to him before the credits roll by the end of the episode, he is home. The house on Evergreen Terrace. The couch. Marge somewhere nearby. Bart and Lisa in whatever corner of the house they inhabit. Maggie in her corner, watching. If the coma theory is true, that return home isn't narrative convenience. It's Homer's mind, doing the only thing it knows how to do with whatever time it has left, putting itself back in the place that matters most. Bringing the simulation back to the thing it was always really about, underneath all the space travel and the celebrity cameos and the increasingly surreal plots. The family. Just the family. On the couch. Home. If the radiation theory is true, then every one of those homecomings is a mutated man returning to his mutated family in their contaminated house, on their contaminated street, in their contaminated town, and somehow, despite all of it, finding something worth coming home to. If the denial theory is true, then every homecoming is Springfield's deepest agreement, the unspoken vote that says, whatever happened today, we're still here. We're still this. The structure holds. The show will never confirm any of the theories we've explored. It will never officially endorse one reading over another. It will keep producing episodes in which Springfield resets, and nobody ages, and the nuclear plant keeps leaking, and Burns keeps surviving, and Ned keeps forgiving, and Maggie keeps watching, and Homer keeps coming home. The loop will keep floating, but that's all right. The mysteries don't need to be solved to be worth exploring. The Springfield we find when we pull at the threads, the one with all the buried storylines and the accumulated damage and the strange, sad beauty of a family held in amber because someone loved them too much to let them go, that Springfield is more interesting than the one on the surface. More complicated, more true. Lisa is 8 years old and she keeps asking questions that nobody wants to answer. She's the only person in Springfield who hasn't stopped looking. And after 36 years, she still hasn't found a satisfying answer to the most fundamental question this town raises. Why are we all like this? Maybe that's the real mystery. Not who shot Mr. Burns, or where Springfield is, or how Burns stays alive, or what Maggie is waiting for. Maybe the real mystery is why we keep coming back, why the loop matters. Why a cartoon family in a fictional town with impossible geography and contaminated water and a comatose patriarch and a baby who might be the most dangerous person in the building, why any of that feels like home? Maybe it's because they're us. Messy and imperfect and a little damaged and somehow, despite all of it, still trying to be a family. Still coming home at the end of the episode. Still finding something on that couch worth sitting down for. The Simpsons has been running since 1989. It doesn't look like it's stopping. And honestly, neither do we. Sleep well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. End of script. Production notes for 11 Labs. Pace. Slow and steady throughout. Slightly slower during emotional moments. Coma theory ending, Mona death, Ned section. Tone. Warm, curious, gently analytical like a late-night documentary narrator who genuinely loves the subject. Pauses. After each section heading, after rhetorical questions, after major reveals. Emphasis. Avoid heavy stress on any single word. Let meaning build through pacing rather than vocal volume. Music notes. Ambient instrumental works best under this nothing with melody that could distract. Gentle, low-frequency drone, or soft piano, at very low volume. Expanded deep dives going further into each mystery. The nuclear theory, what the evidence really adds up to. Let's go deeper into the radiation theory than we went the first time, because there's a layer of detail underneath the headlines that makes the case even stronger. The mutations, the cover-up, the cognitive damage, those are the broad strokes. But there are smaller details distributed across the show's run that, individually, are easy to dismiss, and that collectively form a picture so consistent it becomes very difficult to explain away. Consider the water. Springfield's water supply is drawn from sources that the plant has been contaminating for decades. The show establishes this fairly directly. Radioactive waste goes into rivers. those rivers flow somewhere. The water treatment infrastructure that converts river water into tap water is not presented as particularly sophisticated. This is Springfield, where the government's response to most problems is underfunded and run by people whose qualifications range from minimal to actively compromised. So the contamination that goes into the rivers moves through the system, reduced but not eliminated, and arrives at the taps in every home and business in the area. Now consider how many scenes in The Simpsons involve people drinking water. Homer drinks from the tap, from the garden hose, from whatever vessel is available. The kids drink water at school. Marge cooks with it. The school fountain, which receives the same municipal supply, runs constantly during school hours when hundreds of children are drinking from it every day. For a population to receive sustained, low-level radiation exposure through drinking water over multiple decades, you don't need dramatic contamination events. You need consistent, quiet, unmonitored background levels accumulating in tissue over time. That is exactly what the show depicts. The three-eyed fish is the most visible biological evidence, but it's far from the only one. The Springfield wildlife more broadly doesn't behave normally. Squirrels in Springfield have been shown with characteristics that diverge from their species baseline. Birds in the area display mutations. The trees near the plant grow in directions and patterns that suggest something in the soil has altered their growth. These details appear and disappear quickly in individual episodes, never quite being assembled into a coherent argument the show is explicitly making, but they accumulate. The luminous rats are worth a longer look. Bioluminescence in animals occurs naturally in some species deep-sea creatures that generate their own light through chemical processes for specific ecological functions. In a mammal living in a temperate climate, inside an industrial building, it does not occur through any natural mechanism. The only thing that causes a warm-blooded land mammal to emit visible light is the absorption of radioactive material at levels sufficient to cause chemical changes in the tissues. The rats in the plant's basement glow because they have absorbed enough radioactive material to produce that effect. They are the blinky equivalent among the facility's mammalian inhabitants, and they move freely. They exit through gaps in the infrastructure and enter the surrounding environment, carrying whatever they've absorbed into the ecosystem around them. Nobody mentions this in the episode where it appears. It's visual background information delivered and moved past so smoothly that you absorb it without quite registering that you've been told something significant. This is a consistent technique in how the show presents the radiation evidence. It tells you things that, assembled together, constitute a strong argument. But it tells you each individual thing in a context of jokes and rapid forward motion, so the individual revelations never accumulate into sustained analysis. The show trusts the audience not to compare notes across episodes, and for most of its run, that trust has been well placed. The four-fingered hands deserve specific attention because they represent the most universal mutation in the show, the one that affects literally every human character in Springfield, with no exceptions that aren't themselves notable. 4 fingers on each hand, in every resident, in every person born in Springfield, in every character whose family has lived there for any significant period. A genetic characteristic affecting every member of a geographically defined population in a way that doesn't appear in any neighboring area. When characters from outside arrive, they have 5 fingers. When Springfield residents travel, their 4-fingered hands look different from the hands of the people around them. The show uses art style as the surface explanation, but the in-universe implication, if you follow it, is that this is a population-level mutation with a population-level cause, the cause that is present in Springfield and not in surrounding areas. The cause that has been operating for long enough that children born in Springfield carry the mutation without any additional exposure being required. It has become heritable. It's in the population's genetics now. Burns knows the detailed mechanism. This isn't speculative. The show establishes that Burns has access to medical research, radiological expertise, and pharmaceutical development capabilities that nobody else in Springfield can touch. He has been managing his own radiation-related biology for decades. The treatments that keep him alive require precise knowledge of how radiation interacts with living tissue. Burns understands, at a technical level, what radiation does to cells and DNA and neurological function. He understands it because he is personally dependent on managing those interactions, and he owns the source of the contamination. He has monitoring equipment and testing capabilities. He knows what's happening. His deliberate employment of Homer as safety inspector is the final piece that converts the theory from Burns is negligent to Burns is strategic. He rehired Homer specifically after competent outsiders, identified Homer as the problem, and moved to remove him. The German investors who briefly owned the plant didn't see Homer as an asset, they saw him as a liability that needed to be eliminated before serious remediation work could begin. Burns bought the plant back and reinstated Homer within a very short time frame. The message is not ambiguous if you look at it clearly. Homer's incompetence is the feature, not the bug. Homer ensures the violations continue not through some passive coincidence, but because Burns deliberately maintains the conditions that make Homer's continued incompetent presence possible. There is a darker version of this theory that the show never quite states, but that the evidence supports. What if Burns has been running a long-term experiment? What if Springfield, for Burns, functions not just as a convenient externality of his nuclear operations, but as a controlled study in the effects of long-term radiation exposure on a human population? He has the resources to fund and analyze such research. He has the subjects an entire town that drinks contaminated water and lives under the radiation plume from cracked cooling towers. He has the medical infrastructure to track results and develop treatments. The treatments that keep him alive are sophisticated enough to require significant research and development. That research had to start somewhere. That somewhere may be Springfield. If true, Burns's refusal to remediate the plant is not primarily about the $56 million cost. It's about maintaining experimental conditions. A remediated plant produces different data. A cleaned water supply interrupts a decades-long longitudinal study. Burns isn't just refusing to fix the problem for financial reasons. He may be refusing to fix it because the problem, from his perspective, is providing information. This reading makes some of Burns's behavior considerably more sinister. His regular monitoring of Homer, the occasional checkups, the physical examinations the show depicts, stops being incidental managerial attention and starts looking like data collection. His detailed knowledge of Homer's physical and cognitive state stops looking like a billionaire's eccentric familiarity with a particular employee and starts looking like a researcher tracking a subject. Springfield isn't just a town Burns owns. In this reading, it's a laboratory he has been operating for decades, and every resident is a subject who never consented to participate. The coma theory, the evidence in the episodes. The tonal shift after the coma is the broadest evidence, but there's a finer-grained analysis available that makes the theory more compelling. Let's look at specific episodes and what they show about the quality of Homer's dreaming brain over time. The earliest post-coma episodes are still relatively internally consistent. Season 5 and Season 6, while strange by the standards of the pre-coma show, maintain their own narrative logic. The stories track. Characters behave consistently with their established characterization. The rules of the universe are bent, but they're bent in ways that follow recognizable patterns. The dream brain, in its early stages, is producing a high-quality simulation. By Season 9, the consistency starts fraying in ways that go beyond deliberate creative escalation. Stories contradict previous stories in ways that don't function as deliberate jokes about continuity. Characters behave in ways that contradict their established psychological makeup, not for satirical effect, but seemingly because the dream has lost precision in its modeling of who these people are. Burns does things that don't follow from his established intelligence. Homer forgets things about his own life that he definitively knew in earlier seasons. By the later seasons, the fraying is so pronounced that entire episodes exist in what feels like a different reality than the one established earlier. Not a different creative direction, but a different coherence level. The simulation is losing resolution in the areas that require the most sustained attention to maintain. This mirrors what we know about the effects of prolonged unconsciousness on the brain's capacity to generate and maintain complex internal states. The early coma produces relatively intact dreaming. As the brain's condition declines from the physiological effects of prolonged unconsciousness, the cellular damage, the metabolic effects, the gradual loss of the neural architecture required to sustain complex cognitive output, the quality of the generated experience deteriorates. Consistency requires more cognitive resources than the damaged brain can maintain. The simulation becomes cruder. Characters become less precisely themselves. The rules become less consistently enforced. The show has been documenting Homer's neurological decline across 36 years in this reading. Every season that goes by and feels less coherent than the ones before, it isn't evidence of creative exhaustion. It's evidence of a brain that's been running the same simulation for a very long time and is beginning to lose the capacity to maintain it. The celebrity flood that begins in the mid-seasons also tracks this interpretation with unsettling precision. In the early seasons, celebrity guest appearances are fairly unusual and are integrated into the story with some care. The celebrity's presence serves the narrative in some way. By the later seasons, celebrity appearances happen constantly, and their connection to any organic narrative logic is often thin. A famous person shows up, exists in the story briefly, and leaves, and their presence didn't require them to be who they are in any specific way. This is consistent with how an unconscious brain would process ambient sound. The brain in a coma-adjacent state picks up sounds from the environment, a television in the room, conversations near the bed, radios in the hallway. It processes these sounds in a degraded, inconsistent way. Names register without full context. Voices are heard without the visual information that would make them fully meaningful. The dream brain converts these partial inputs into characters who appear in the simulation without being fully integrated into it. Early in the coma, Homer's brain is generating characters from internal memory with high fidelity. Later, it increasingly draws on fragmentary external input, and those fragments don't integrate as cleanly. The celebrities show up because they're appearing in ambient media around Homer's bed. They don't integrate cleanly because the brain incorporating them isn't working from complete information, just from a name and a tone of voice half heard through the fog. There is one element of the coma theory that nobody in the fan community spends as much time with as it deserves: the show's treatment of memory and forgetting. The Springfield that Homer dreams about consistently fails to maintain memory of dramatic events between episodes. A catastrophe happens, something that should permanently alter the town's relationship to its circumstances, and the next episode proceeds as if it didn't. This is usually explained as episodic television's structural requirements. But in a coma dream, forgetting between episodes isn't a structural choice. It's a neurological inevitability. The hippocampus, which manages the consolidation of short-term memory into long-term storage, requires sleep to do most of that work. A brain in a coma is not sleeping in any way that allows normal memory consolidation. Each episode of the dream begins from the same baseline because the brain cannot consolidate the previous episode's events into persistent memory. Homer's dream Springfield resets between episodes not because the writers want it to, but because Homer's brain cannot hold the previous dream's content across the gap between dreaming cycles. This is the most quietly elegant structural match between the coma theory and the show's actual production behavior. The reset isn't a convention, it's a symptom. And God's warning, 6 months before the vending machine fell, stays with you if you sit with it. In Homer, the heretic, God appears and speaks to Homer about his life and his future. The divine presence in the show is established as genuinely theological rather than metaphorical. God actually exists in this universe and has apparently decided, for reasons the show doesn't fully unpack, to make himself available to Homer Simpson specifically. In that conversation, God says Homer's time is coming. Not yet, but it's coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. If you read that line as a straightforward narrative prediction, if God was telling Homer that his conscious life was approaching its end, that the waking world was nearly done for him, then the conversation in Homer, the heretic, becomes the show's most significant scene. Not theologically significant. Structurally significant. The show, in its own voice, told the audience what was about to happen. And the audience laughed at the joke and didn't notice the announcement underneath it. The show told you in 1992 what was going to happen in 1993. Nobody caught it. And the writers may have planned it that way, or they may have left it lying there for someone to find and never said publicly which one it was. The ambiguity is itself a kind of answer. The Burns shooting a complete case review. There are several elements of the Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery that get less attention than the sundial and the DNA evidence, but that are worth examining carefully because they change the shape of the possible answers. The gun's absence from the holster is one of the most important and least discussed details. Before the shooting, in the extended confrontation scene at the town meeting, Burns's holster is shown on screen, and it's empty. The gun is already gone from his person before the confrontation disperses, and before he walks outside to the parking lot where the shooting allegedly occurred. This means that whoever shot Burns either took the gun from him during the meeting in a crowd, In a moment of physical proximity, or the gun was transferred from Burns to the eventual shooter in some other way before the attack. The official account requires us to believe that the gun fell from Burns's holster during the struggle over Maggie's lollipop in the parking lot, and that Maggie picked it up and it discharged. But the holster is already empty inside the building before Burns goes to the parking lot. If the gun fell from the holster during the parking lot encounter, it was already missing from the holster that's shown on screen. Either the show made a continuity error that undermines its own answer, or the gun changed hands inside the building during the meeting, which means whoever had it afterward is the shooter, and the shooting didn't happen the way Burns described it. Burns describes a scene in the parking lot: a lollipop, a struggle, a fallen gun. But Burns was shot, then lost consciousness, then was in a coma for weeks. His account of what happened in the parking lot is his first conscious attempt to reconstruct the events, made immediately after regaining consciousness, with a bullet wound in his body and weeks of medical trauma behind him. His account is the testimony of a coma survivor making his first effort to explain events he experienced while under enormous physiological stress. Coma survivors' accounts of events immediately surrounding their loss of consciousness are known to be unreliable in specific ways. Trauma affects memory encoding. The period immediately before consciousness is lost is often poorly consolidated. A man who was shot, lost consciousness, and woke up weeks later describing with confidence exactly what happened in the moments between the gunshot and his unconsciousness is presenting a memory that the psychological literature would flag as requiring careful corroboration. The police never meaningfully corroborated it. They had DNA that pointed to a Simpson, but the DNA was an eyelash, and eyelashes transfer through contact and proximity and air currents and a dozen non-criminal mechanisms that have nothing to do with the shooting. The eyelash points to a Simpson having been near Burns at some point. It doesn't establish who, when, or in what context. Homer's fingerprints on the gun are significant and then unexplained once Maggie is identified as the shooter. If Maggie fired the gun, how did Homer's fingerprints get on it? If the gun was in Burns's holster, how did Homer's prints get on it before the holster was emptied? This detail appears during the investigation and then disappears without being satisfactorily resolved by the Maggie answer. The Homer in Season 18 confession is treated as the throwaway line that it appears to be, and this dismissal is itself worth examining. In any real criminal justice context, an unsolicited verbal confession to an attempted murder would reopen the investigation. Homer confesses on camera that he shot Burns. The response is laughter or indifference. Nobody files a report, nobody revisits the file. The confession evaporates. Within the denial theory framework, this is perfectly consistent. Springfield has officially closed the case. Maggie is the answer. The community has collectively agreed on this. A confession that challenges the agreed-upon conclusion isn't treated as a confession, it's treated as noise. It's filed under the same category as everything else Springfield has agreed not to hear. Homer can confess all he likes. Springfield isn't listening. But if the confession is real, if Homer is telling the truth, then the architecture of the cover-up becomes clear. Homer shot Burns. The investigation pointed at Homer through the fingerprints and the DNA. Burns woke up and, rather than confirm what was being suggested by the evidence, redirected to Maggie. Burns had a reason to protect Homer. A dead Burns has no power. A Burns who successfully prosecutes Homer for the shooting loses his leverage because a Homer in prison is no longer useful as the deliberately incompetent safety inspector whose incompetence Burns requires. Burns needed Homer free. Burns needed Homer at work. Pointing at Maggie was the move that preserved the arrangement. Maggie was perfect because she was untouchable. A baby cannot be convicted. A baby cannot deny the accusation. A baby cannot explain that she saw something or didn't do something. Maggie was the cleanest possible resolution. She took the official blame. Burns kept his employee. Homer went back to Sector 7G. The deal held. And Maggie, in the empty room, reenacted the gesture not because she did it, but because she watched it happen. She watched someone shoot Mr. Burns. She is old enough cognitively to retain that memory and to be affected by it. The gesture is memory, not confession. She is sitting alone processing something she witnessed, and she will never say a word about it. Because the moment she says a word, she has to be a witness. And being a witness in Springfield is how you end up tied to a railroad car. Mr. Burns, the full scope of his power. To understand why Burns can stay alive for over a century, it helps to understand what his wealth actually looks like when deployed at its full extent. The show gives us pieces of this picture across many episodes, and the complete image is worth assembling. Burns has private medical facilities, not just access to private doctors, actual physical infrastructure dedicated to his medical maintenance. The weekly treatment regimen requires equipment that doesn't exist in standard hospitals and pharmaceutical compounds that aren't available through conventional channels. Someone has to manufacture these compounds. Someone has to operate the equipment. Someone has to ensure the facility functions correctly every week with zero error margin. All of this infrastructure exists because Burns's wealth makes it possible to build and sustain it. He also has legal infrastructure on a scale that makes regulatory accountability essentially theoretical. Springfield's government is depicted as weak, easily influenced, and chronically under-resourced. The state government, wherever that is similarly presented as susceptible to the kind of influence that substantial money can purchase. The federal government makes occasional appearances in Springfield's story, the EPA in the film, the FBI in the Mona storyline, but these federal interventions are short-lived and ultimately unsuccessful at producing lasting change. Burns's legal resources are extensive enough to resist, delay, and eventually outlast regulatory pressure in almost every instance. This is why the 342 violations never get addressed. Not because the violation of regulatory standards is inherently difficult to address. A well-funded government agency with clear authority could address those violations and force remediation. But the government agencies in Springfield's orbit don't appear to have the sustained institutional capacity and political will to see that process through against a target with Burns's legal and financial resources. The violations persist because the enforcement system doesn't have what it would need to overcome the resistance Burns can deploy. The historical dimension of Burns's story, his age, his memories of events spanning from before the 20th century, adds a layer to the power analysis. Burns has been operating in this environment long enough to have outlasted the individuals and institutions that might once have constrained him. Regulators who came in with genuine intent to address the plant's problems have retired or died. Investigative journalists who might have been building a case have moved on. Political opponents who found electoral success partly on anti-Burns platforms have completed their careers. Burns simply outlives the resistance. Not through any clever strategy in the moment, but through the basic arithmetic of being alive longer than anyone opposing him. This is the most terrifying kind of institutional power. Not the power that defeats you in the moment, but the power that simply waits for you to die. Burns can sit on a pile of violations and contamination and historical crimes indefinitely because the people who care about those things have human lifespans and Burns apparently does not. Smithers' role in maintaining this has an element that the show gestures toward without fully unpacking. Smithers is the single human being who knows the most about how Burns actually functions. He knows the treatment schedule. He knows what happens if it's interrupted. He knows the full scope of Burns's medical situation and the dependency relationships it creates. This knowledge gives Smithers a kind of power over Burns that the show never quite dramatizes, but that sits in the background of their relationship at all times. Smithers could, theoretically, simply stop scheduling the appointments. He could miss 1 week. He could allow the disease equilibrium to collapse, and Burns would be gone within days. The most powerful man in Springfield is one scheduling failure away from death. The person holding that scheduling is the person who appears to be his subordinate. The power dynamics in the Burns-Smithers relationship are more complex than they look from outside. The show suggests that Smithers stays because he loves Burns, and this is portrayed as genuine rather than ironic. But the relationship that keeps Burns alive is not primarily one of sentiment. It's one of specific, irreplaceable operational competence. Burns cannot replace Smithers with someone who would do the job as well, because what Smithers does isn't just administrative support. It's the management of a life support system that requires intimate knowledge of its particular subject. You can't onboard a new Smithers. The institutional knowledge required to keep Burns alive is not transferable. Smithers knows this. Burns knows this. The affection between them exists within a structure of mutual dependency that neither of them fully acknowledges out loud. Skinner and Tamzarian what Springfield's denial looks like at scale. The Tamzarian revelation isn't just the most explicit version of Springfield's denial mechanism. It's the most philosophically coherent one. because it's the only version where the denial is consciously chosen by people who know what they're denying. In every other instance of Springfield's collective forgetting the dome, the nuclear near misses, the environmental catastrophes, it's possible to argue that people simply moved on in the normal human way, that forgetting is a passive process, and that the town's amnesia doesn't require active maintenance. The principal and the pauper eliminates that interpretive escape. The town voted. A judge issued a decree. The expulsion of the real Seymour Skinner was an active, legally formalized rejection of documented truth by a community that had full access to that truth and chose to reject it through a formal, deliberative process. This is worth sitting with, because it changes the nature of everything else the show does with collective forgetting. If this is what Springfield's truth rejection mechanism looks like when it's made visible, a town meeting, a vote, a judge, a train, then all the other instances of forgetting aren't passive at all. They're the same vote, happening invisibly. The decision not to follow up on the three-eyed fish was a vote. The decision not to pursue the skeletons in the basement was a vote. The decision not to demand an investigation of Burns after the dome went up was a vote. All of them made the same way through the unspoken social contract that says this is too destabilizing to acknowledge, so we won't, and we will treat anyone who insists on it as the problem rather than the truth they're carrying. The real Seymour Skinner's experience is the template. He showed up with legitimate claims. His documentation was real. His identity was his. And Springfield's response was to remove him, not to call him a liar, not to dispute his evidence, but to formally decide that the community's comfort was more important than his legitimacy, and to enforce that decision through institutional authority. This is a pattern that plays out in Springfield with people who carry inconvenient truths. They don't get argued with. The truth doesn't get disputed. The community just reroutes the consensus reality around them and removes them from the conversation by making their continued presence in it too costly. Lisa has experienced softer versions of this her entire life. Her intelligence and her willingness to state uncomfortable observations have made her a figure Springfield is perpetually managing, acknowledging just enough to not seem actively hostile, while ensuring that nothing she says produces lasting change. The real Skinner is the extreme version. The version where the management stops being subtle and becomes explicit, judicial, and physically enforced. He's tied to a train because having him present in the community makes the agreed-upon truth too difficult to maintain. The exile isn't punishment in the conventional sense. It's maintenance of consensus reality. What the show doesn't depict, and what the denial theory asks you to imagine, is what that exiled man thinks about and feels on that train. He survived a prisoner of war camp. He came home. He found his life occupied. He tried to reclaim it through entirely legitimate means. And the response was a community vote, a legal decree, and a train. The last honest person in Springfield moving away from it at speed. Springfield doesn't know he exists anymore. The decree made it illegal to acknowledge that he does. And the town proceeds as if the agreement were always the reality. This is what the denial mechanism looks like when you can see the whole machine. Maggie the long game. The strategic patience argument for Maggie's silence is worth exploring in more detail because the evidence for it goes beyond the broad strokes we covered earlier. Consider the daycare rebellion in the context of organizational theory. Maggie didn't just protect a caterpillar in the longest daycare. She did something considerably more complex. She identified an authority structure, assessed its vulnerabilities, developed a plan to work within and around it, encountered resistance from a peer competitor with different goals, adapted her strategy in real time, and ultimately succeeded in an objective that required the cooperation of the facility's larger environment. All of this without speech, without the ability to write, and with physical capabilities limited to crawling and unsteady walking. The organizational achievement here is not the butterfly rescue, which is the emotional focus of the film. The organizational achievement is that Maggie did all of this alone, using only environmental improvisation and her own assessment of available resources, without being able to communicate her plan to any ally or recruit any assistance. She executed a complex operation entirely through solo decision-making in real time against adaptive opposition. This is a level of executive function that the psychological literature associates with adults who have specific and practiced capacities for strategic thinking. It is not associated with 12-month-old infants at any developmental threshold that research has established. Maggie is either an extreme developmental outlier at a level that would make her a subject of global scientific study if anyone noticed, or she is something that the radiation theory would predict and the coma theory would explain a being operating at a cognitive level her physical development cannot support. The silence itself deserves more analysis than it usually gets. The show establishes very early that Maggie can make sounds. She responds to her name, she reacts to voices, her pacifier produces audible noise she can modulate. The motor capacity for speech exists, the vocal apparatus is functional. What's absent is the deployment of that capacity in any sustained, communicative way. Babies acquire language through a process of imitation, reinforcement, and social engagement. They are motivated to speak because speaking produces responses from caregivers. The responsiveness of the environment to a baby's vocalizations is what drives language acquisition. Maggie exists in an extremely verbal household where vocalizations from any source produce immediate social responses. She has every environmental condition required for language acquisition. And she has not acquired language in 36 years. One explanation is developmental delay, but the show consistently demonstrates that Maggie's cognitive capacities are functioning at an extraordinary level. The silence cannot be explained by cognitive limitations because the same brain that maintains the silence is operating at a level that exceeds cognitive limitation. The alternative explanation is that Maggie has assessed the communicative environment she's in and decided that not speaking serves her interests better than speaking would. She has watched what happens when people communicate in this household and this town. She has watched Lisa speak her mind and be consistently dismissed, patronized, or ignored. She has watched Homer speak and produce consequences that he rarely fully anticipates or manages. She has watched the adults around her spend enormous energy on verbal communication that consistently fails to produce the outcomes they're seeking. And she has watched what she can accomplish in silence. She shot the most powerful man in the region and was classified as a non-threat because of her silence, because the assumption that a silent baby cannot be an actor with intentions is so deeply embedded that the people around her never seriously interrogated it. She led an organized resistance in a daycare facility and succeeded completely because nobody monitors silent babies closely enough to notice them organizing. She has saved her family multiple times through actions that required precision timing and clear strategic thinking, and those actions have gone essentially unattributed because the family's attention is always elsewhere. Silence isn't just Maggie's defense. It's her most powerful active tool. As long as she speaks, she is a baby in a crib. As long as she doesn't speak, she is the safest, most unmonitored, most freedom-retaining member of the household. She can move through the day pursuing whatever her goals are, and the show never tells us precisely what those goals are without anyone knowing that she has goals. The question of what Maggie is waiting for is genuinely open. The show has offered futures for every other character through flash-forwards and speculative episodes. Lisa becomes president in one imagined future. Bart becomes various things in various projections. Homer's trajectory is traced repeatedly. Maggie's future is the one that remains, across 36 years, essentially blank. She is the only Simpson whose adulthood the show has never depicted. This might be the deliberate construction of a mystery with a long runway, or it might be that Maggie's future is genuinely unknown because what Maggie becomes depends entirely on what Maggie decides. The other characters' futures are predictable from their established trajectories. Maggie's isn't predictable because Maggie is the one character in the show who is entirely in control of her own decisions in a way that nobody around her recognizes. When she decides, Springfield will find out what she was waiting for, but she will decide when she's ready on her timeline. After whatever observation period she determines is complete. That is potentially the most dangerous thing about a 1-year-old who has been 1-year-old for 36 years. The predictions, the deeper cultural mechanism, the confirmation bias explanation for the predictions phenomenon is correct as far as it goes. But there's a mechanism underneath it that's worth examining more carefully because it illuminates something real about how deeply embedded The Simpsons actually is in American culture. When the show made the Trump as president joke in 2000, that joke didn't just enter circulation and then sit passively waiting for reality to catch up. It actively shaped how millions of people subsequently processed political news involving Trump. Every subsequent Trump political development, his 2000 flirtation with the Reform Party, his later discussions of running, his 2015 announcement, his 2016 campaign was processed by people who had seen the joke through the lens. The joke provided. The Simpsons had given them a frame. When reality filled the frame, the response wasn't just recognition. The recognition was partly the result of the frame having been there. This is how cultural priming works at scale. A sufficiently widely distributed piece of content doesn't just predict or describe cultural events, it contributes to making those events feel comprehensible and, in some cases, to making them more likely to occur. Not through any direct causal mechanism, but through the way that collective imagination, shaped by widely shared cultural artifacts, affects how people respond to possibilities. If enough people experience a possible future as already somehow familiar, already depicted, already processed, already a known frame, that familiarity slightly increases the cognitive accessibility of that future when decision-relevant moments arise. This is speculative in its application to any specific prediction, but as a general principle of how culturally pervasive media works, it's well established. The Simpsons has been culturally pervasive for 36 years. The predictions that came true were all in areas where the show's commentary was widely enough distributed to potentially have contributed to the priming effect. Media consolidation, celebrity politics, technological development trajectories. The show's writing staff's backgrounds are also worth more attention. Multiple writers with graduate-level training in mathematics, physics, computer science, and political science are not an accidental feature of the show's history. These are people whose professional training includes the systematic analysis of complex systems, the identification of emergent properties in those systems, and the projection of those systems' trajectories forward under various conditions. They're not making predictions in the casual sense. They're doing something closer to applied extrapolation, identifying real structural forces, and asking where those forces lead if they continue operating without major disruption. The Higgs boson equation is the most technically specific prediction and the one that's most difficult to explain purely as coincidence. The equation attributed to Homer in a 1998 episode isn't just vaguely reminiscent of particle physics. Physicists who have analyzed it have noted that it's a reasonable approximation of a formula relevant to predicting the mass of the then undiscovered Higgs boson. The show had at least one writer with graduate-level mathematical training at the time this episode was produced. The equation may not have been a guess. It may have been a calculation by someone who knew enough about the relevant physics to produce a reasonable approximation of an answer that experimental confirmation was still 14 years away from providing. That's not prophecy. That's mathematics. But it's the kind of mathematics that only looks like prediction to people who don't know it was possible. To the person who wrote it down, it was a calculation with a reasonable basis in known physics. The mystery dissolves when you know how the trick works. But knowing how the trick works doesn't make the trick less impressive. The Cypress Hill collaboration is the most fun of the specific predictions because it's the most purely cultural and the most difficult to explain as trend extrapolation. In 1996, the show depicted Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra through a mishap involving altered states and miscommunication. That specific combination, this hip-hop group, this classical orchestra, then actually happened in 2024 when Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall, 28 years apart. There is no trend analysis that predicted this. The show made a specific, concrete, absurd joke about a specific pairing that no reasonable analysis of cultural trends in 1996 would have suggested was likely, and then that specific pairing actually occurred more than 2 decades later. Coincidence is the honest answer here, and it's a sufficient one. Over 800 episodes of specific pop cultural jokes, some specific pop cultural coincidences will accumulate. But the Cypress Hill case is the one that makes even the people who fully understand and accept the statistical explanation pause for a moment. 28 years is a long time. The specificity is unusual, and the coincidence is complete rather than approximate. Maybe the writers of the 1996 episode are laughing somewhere. Maybe they're as surprised as everyone else. Maybe the long runway between joke and event is the thing that made it feel, when it arrived, more like revelation than coincidence. By 2024, the episode was old enough that the people who remembered it didn't remember the specific joke. They just remembered the moment of recognition when the announcement circulated. The Simpsons predicted this. Whether that's true or false matters less, at that point, than that it feels true. And the feeling of truth about the show's predictive capacity is itself part of what the show has become in American culture. A cultural institution that is understood to have foreseen what's coming. That reputation is now self-sustaining regardless of whether any individual prediction actually holds up. Mona Simpson. The ripple effects. The Mona storyline has implications that extend further than the immediate Burns conspiracy. Let's follow some of those threads. Homer's inability to connect the dots between Burns and his mother isn't just a tragedy about Homer's cognitive limitations. It's a tragedy about what systemic exposure to power does to the people caught inside it. Homer's brain has been damaged by radiation, by the crayon, by a lifetime of low-level cognitive insults that have compounded in ways nobody in his life has ever fully recognized or addressed. But even if his brain had escaped all of those insults, he would still have grown up in a community that is structured to prevent certain thoughts from completing. The culture of Springfield, the social contract of collective forgetting, the implicit agreement not to trace inconvenient connections back to their sources, all of that would still be operating on Homer even without the physical brain damage. The brain damage makes the resistance to clear thinking more complete. But the cultural environment was already doing significant work before the neurological factors were added. Mona's story is also a story about what happens to people who break with that cultural environment and try to actually challenge the power structure. She identified a real harm, a biological weapons program in her town. She took direct action against it. She succeeded in the specific sense that the weapons were destroyed, and the price was everything. She lost her husband, her son, her home, her freedom, her ordinary life. For 27 years, she lived as a fugitive, unable to return to the child she left behind, knowing that the man she made an enemy of was powerful enough and personally vindictive enough to hunt her across decades. The lesson Springfield teaches about resistance is visible in Mona's story. The lesson is, the cost is total and the victory is temporary. The biological weapons lab was destroyed. Burns built other things. The cost to Mona of destroying it was her family for the rest of her life. The lesson to anyone watching Mona's trajectory is that direct action against Burns produces complete personal destruction without producing lasting change to the system. Burns rebuilds. Burns retaliates. Burns endures. This is one of the reasons Springfield maintains its passive relationship to Burns's power so consistently. It's not only that the population is cognitively impaired by radiation, it's that the few people who have tried, in good faith and at great personal cost, to challenge that power have been destroyed. The information about what happens to people who fight back is available to Springfield's residents, at least in outline. Mona Simpson's story, while not fully known, is not entirely unknown. Homer's mother is a fugitive. People know that. What they're supposed to infer from that knowledge that fighting Burns produces that outcome is the social knowledge that keeps most resistance from forming. Grandpa's deal with Burns is its own tragedy. Abe found leverage. He discovered something Burns had done that was actionable, something that gave Abe real power in that moment, and he traded that leverage for a job guarantee for his son. Not for justice, not for accountability, not for any attempt to address what had been done for a job guarantee. He converted the only real leverage the Simpson family ever held against Burns into employment security for Homer. The choice is comprehensible. Abe didn't have the resources or the support structures to pursue the leverage into actual accountability. What he could do with it was extract something of immediate practical value for his family. A guaranteed job for a son he knew would struggle without that guarantee. That's the compromise of a man who has assessed his realistic options and made the most of the narrow one available to him. But the consequence is that Burns emerged from the one moment of real vulnerability the show depicts him as having with his position entirely intact. The leverage evaporated into a private deal. Burns went back to operating as before. The only thing that changed was that Homer now had a job guarantee, which helped Homer and simultaneously made Homer useful to Burns in a way Burns could exploit indefinitely. Homer's job at the plant isn't just guaranteed by the deal. Homer's job at the plant is the deal. Homer's presence there, his guaranteed continued incompetence, his role as the safety inspector who ensures no inspection ever produces genuine accountability, all of that was purchased by Grandpa's decision to trade leverage for stability. Grandpa thought he was protecting Homer. He was actually delivering Homer into the arrangement Burns needed him in. 3 generations making the best decisions they could in situations structured by one man's power, and every decision ending in a result that served that man's interests more than their own. Mona fought back and lost everything, while Burns rebuilt. Abe made a deal and delivered Homer to Burns, who needed him exactly where he ended up. Homer inherited the consequences of both and works in the building that is the cause of all of it, without being able to hold both ends of the chain in his mind simultaneously. That's the architecture of power that The Simpsons has been describing for 36 years, not through political argument or sustained didactic analysis. Through the particular story of one family and one billionaire and one contaminated town, the specific always being more true than the abstract, Springfield's geography, the legal argument. The most practically significant dimension of Springfield's geographic ambiguity is the one that gets the least attention in fan discussions, the legal one. Environmental regulation in the United States operates through a system of overlapping federal, state, and local jurisdictions. The EPA has federal authority over the most severe environmental violations, but its capacity to enforce that authority depends on cooperation from state agencies and on establishing clear jurisdictional claims. State environmental agencies have primary responsibility for most day-to-day regulatory work, but their authority is geographically specific. A state agency can only regulate within the state. If Springfield's location is genuinely ambiguous, if it sits in legal gray area between multiple state jurisdictions, if there are legitimate disputes about which state's environmental law applies, then the regulatory machinery has a fundamental difficulty establishing the clear jurisdictional claim required to take sustained enforcement. Action. Every time a regulatory agency moves toward enforcement, Burns's lawyers can raise the jurisdictional question. Every time that question is raised, the enforcement process slows while the jurisdictional issue is resolved. The resolution produces a claim that Burns's lawyers then challenge from a different angle. The cycle can be sustained almost indefinitely with sufficient legal resources, and Burns has sufficient legal resources. This isn't conspiracy theorizing. This is how regulatory delay actually works in jurisdictions with genuinely contested boundaries. Regulatory agencies have limited resources. Defending jurisdictional challenges consumes those resources. A well-funded defendant who can generate sustained jurisdictional ambiguity can often outlast regulatory pressure simply by making enforcement more expensive than the agency can afford to sustain. Springfield's impossible geography in this reading is not just a production convenience and not just an in-universe feature of a contaminated zone. It's a legal infrastructure. The geographic ambiguity functions as a standing first defense against any sustained regulatory effort. Before you can regulate the plant, you have to establish that you have the authority to regulate the plant. Before you can establish that authority, you have to establish where the plant is. Before you can establish where the plant is, you have to navigate 36 years of contradictory evidence produced by a show that has deliberately refused to commit to a consistent answer. Burns doesn't have to do anything active to maintain this defense. The show does it for him. Every episode that places Springfield in a different geographic context, every detail that contradicts the previous detail, every writer's room decision to avoid committing to a specific state, all of it contributes to the legal fog that makes external accountability difficult to organize. And behind the laughter, where the location changes between broadcast and syndication, is the most explicit demonstration that even when an answer is provided, that answer is not stable. The location shifts depending on which version of the episode you're watching. If the show cannot maintain a consistent location across different versions of the same episode, no external institution can establish a clear jurisdictional claim based on information the show provides. The ambiguity is the answer. The ambiguity is the point. Springfield exists in a perpetual jurisdictional fog. And Burns, the town's primary power center, has been the primary beneficiary of that fog for 36 years. Whether this was intended or whether it emerged from production decisions made for entirely innocent reasons doesn't change what it produces. The result is a town that cannot be definitively located and therefore cannot be definitively regulated. That's not nothing. For a man managing 342 safety violations at an active nuclear facility, a jurisdictional defense that holds indefinitely has considerable value. The floating timeline. What amber preservation costs? The observation that the Simpsons don't age because we won't let them requires one more layer of analysis, because the cost of that preservation isn't just aesthetic. The characters pay a specific price for existing in permanent present tense. A character who cannot age cannot fully become who they are. Becoming requires time. It requires the accumulation of experience and the change that accumulation produces. It requires making mistakes and learning from them, or not learning from them, and carrying the consequences either way. Characters who reset between episodes and who never age cannot complete the developmental arcs that make fictional characters feel fully real. Lisa Simpson is the most obvious example of this cost. She is one of the most richly realized characters in American television. Her interior life is drawn with an intelligence and emotional precision that has rarely been matched. The show knows who she is, what she wants, what she fears, what she keeps failing at and returning to try again. She is fully seen by the writing, in a way that is genuinely remarkable for a character who has been 8 years old for 36 years. And she cannot grow. She cannot complete the arc her characterization implies. She cannot become the person she is pointing toward because becoming would require aging, and aging is what the loop prohibits. Lisa is perfectly drawn and permanently suspended. She carries the full weight of her character without being allowed to move it anywhere final. There's a version of this that's genuinely heartbreaking if you sit with it. Lisa has been fighting for recognition, fighting against intellectual isolation, fighting for a world that takes her seriously for 36 years. And she hasn't gained any ground in that fight. Not because the fight is unwinnable, but because the loop returns her to the starting position every time she approaches a resolution. She makes progress, and then the episode ends and the next episode begins from the same baseline. She is the character most hurt by the floating timeline, because she is the character with the most active, sustained developmental aspiration that the timeline prevents from completing. Bart's suspension is different in character. Bart at 10 is in some ways Bart's most fully realized form. The rebellion and the mischief and the underlying sweetness and the fear of being unloved are all expressions of things that 10-year-old boys actually feel, and Bart's characterization works partly because those things are authentic to that developmental stage. Bart growing up would complicate the characterization in ways that might not improve it. The suspension serves Bart more than it hurts him. Marge's suspension is the most philosophically complex. Marge is the person who holds the family structure together through sustained, largely unrewarded effort. She is patient and capable, and she has consistently subordinated her own development to the maintenance of the family's functioning. Her characterization is a sustained meditation on what it costs to be the person who holds things together, the specific, daily, invisible labor of maintenance. The loop puts her in permanent performance of that maintenance. She never gets to complete the arc of choosing what her life is for outside that role, because the loop returns her to the maintenance position before any resolution can arrive. Homer's suspension is the one the coma theory explains most elegantly. Homer frozen in the mid-30s is Homer preserved exactly as he was when the vending machine fell. The loop serves Homer's specific interest, the maintenance of the family, as it was at the cost of every other kind of development. He can't become wiser. He can't genuinely repair the damage he's done or receive the repair that's been done to him. He can only keep returning to the same position, having the same kinds of experiences, finding his way home at the end of each one. If this is Homer's dream, then the dream is not a wish for growth. It's a wish for stasis, for things to stay exactly as they were on the last day he was fully conscious. That wish is completely understandable. That wish is heartbreaking in its particularity, and it comes at the cost of everyone in the dream being frozen alongside Homer, unable to become anything except what they were in April of 1993, and what they continue to be in the endlessly cycling present of the simulation. We pressed pause. But the people we paused are still in there, carrying their stories, fighting their battles, trying to become things they will never quite be allowed to become. The amber preserves them. The amber also holds them. That's what it costs. The final thread, everything connected. Every mystery we've explored tonight connects to every other mystery through the same central fact. One man owns a nuclear power plant with 342 safety violations. Everything else follows from that. The contamination explains the mutations, the cognitive damage, the inability of the population to sustain clear thinking about its own circumstances. Burns's need for the contamination to continue explains Homer's employment, the suppression of investigations, the corruption of the medical establishment that could have found the crayon and chose not to. The cognitive damage explains the denial mechanism, the collective forgetting, the vote to exile truth and formalize lies. The denial mechanism explains the floating geography, the perpetual present tense, the episodic reset. The episodic reset is what the coma dream needs to sustain itself. And the coma dream is the most merciful explanation for a man who woke up to find that the world he worked in was owned by the person who destroyed his family. Burns is at the center of every thread. Not because the show is making a simple moral argument about wealth or power, but because Springfield is a contained system and Burns is its organizing principle. The town's economy, its politics, its regulatory environment, its medical establishment, its population's cognitive function, all of it has been shaped, directly or indirectly, by the man on the hill in the enormous house who has been alive for over a century and who intends to remain alive indefinitely. Homer stands at the other center, not because he's the most powerful figure or the most intelligent or the most morally complex, because he is the person through whom we experience Springfield. His consciousness, waking or dreaming, is the lens through which everything arrives. His limitations are our limitations in the story. His loves and losses are where the show's emotional stakes live. Everything that matters in Springfield matters because of what it means to this particular damaged, resilient, thoroughly ordinary man trying to hold on to the family he loves in a system that was built to keep people exactly like him too, impaired to understand what's happening to them. The mystery of Springfield is the mystery of Homer Simpson. How someone can live inside a system designed to damage and control and diminish him and still find reasons to laugh at dinner, still fall asleep on the couch with his arm around the kids, still come home every evening to the same house, the same family, the same ordinary, impossible love that survives everything the loop throws at it. That's Springfield, that's the show. After 36 years and every theory and every buried clue and every piece of evidence we've assembled tonight, the thing at the center is the same thing that's always been at the center. A family. On a couch? On Evergreen Terrace? Finding their way home. Good night. End of extended script. Total word count target. 40,000 plus. 11 Labs production notes. Pace. Slow and deliberate throughout this is sleep content, not documentary. Tone. Warm. Curious. Gently analytical. A late-night narrator who genuinely loves this subject. Pauses. After each section heading. After rhetorical questions. After major reveals. After the closing line of each section. Emphasis. Let meaning build through pacing rather than heavy stress on individual words. Music. Low ambient instrumental with no melodic content that could distract. Soft textural drone at minimal volume, fading slightly in the closing sections. The closing goodnight should be delivered very quietly, with a long pause before it. Additional expansions. The details that linger. On Homer's body, what the show is actually telling you. There's a specific category of Homer Simpson moments that the radiation theory makes genuinely strange rather than simply funny, and it's worth spending time with them because they accumulate into something that is difficult to explain as ordinary cartoon physics. Homer has been shot and survived. He has been electrocuted multiple times and survived. He has fallen from elevated heights that would produce fatal injuries in any documented real-world case and survived. He has been in vehicle accidents at speeds that should have killed him and survived. He has been in explosions, in fires, in industrial accidents inside a nuclear facility, and he has walked away from all of them. In isolation, each of these moments works as a gag. Cartoon physics, the Wile E. Coyote principle, that comedic characters survive what dramatic characters don't. But The Simpsons is not a slapstick cartoon in the tradition that would make pure cartoon physics the satisfying explanation. It's a show with genuine emotional stakes, real character psychology, and plotlines where death and serious injury carry weight. Characters have died on The Simpsons and stayed dead. The show is capable of taking physical consequences seriously when it chooses to. Homer's survival of things that should kill him is something the show uses for comedy without ever quite offering a diegetic explanation. The radiation theory offers that explanation. Homer's biology has been altered by decades of exposure in ways that make his body substantially more resilient to certain categories of physical trauma than an uncontaminated human body would be. Not invulnerable, not healed instantly, but functionally much harder to kill than the baseline suggests. This is consistent with what we know about radiation exposure's effects on biological systems, counterintuitively. At certain dose levels and in certain cellular contexts, radiation exposure produces not just damage but adaptive responses, cellular mechanisms that repair DNA damage more aggressively, that manage oxidative stress more efficiently, that produce a body that is, in certain respects, more physiologically robust than an unexposed baseline. Homer's exposure, which has been effectively continuous throughout his adult working life in direct proximity to an active reactor, may have produced this kind of adaptation alongside the cognitive damage. His pain tolerance is equally relevant. The show repeatedly depicts Homer sustaining injuries that produce extreme pain in normal human characters: cuts, burns, impacts with a pain response that is either absent or dramatically attenuated. He notices injury and then continues without the behavioral disruption that severe pain produces in normal physiology. Either Homer has an unusually high individual pain threshold, or something about his neurology has altered his pain processing in ways that are consistent with chronic exposure to radiation at the levels the plant would produce. The combination of unusually high physical resilience and dramatically diminished cognitive function is the specific fingerprint of the radiation theory applied to Homer's individual biology. His body has adapted to the contamination in ways that make him nearly indestructible physically, while the same contamination has devastated the brain function he would need to understand what's happening to him. He has become perfectly engineered, from the radiation's perspective, to survive in the contaminated environment that is destroying him. He is resilient enough to keep working, damaged enough to keep complying. Burns could not have designed this more precisely if he'd tried. And the question of whether he did try, whether Homer's particular profile of adaptation and damage is the product of deliberate management rather than random mutation, is one the show never directly addresses. But the question is there, once you know to ask it. On Lisa's isolation, the cost of clarity. Lisa Simpson's fundamental situation is one of the most sustained and precisely observed pieces of character writing in American television. She is the person in the room who sees things most clearly. And that clarity has cost her more than almost anything she's gained from it. The show has, across 36 years, depicted Lisa's intelligence as simultaneously her most important characteristic and the primary source of her suffering. She is isolated because she is smart. She is dismissed because she is right. She is lonely because the people around her cannot quite follow where her thinking goes. And the people who could follow it are distributed too sparsely across Springfield for her to maintain consistent connection with any of them. This is drawn with extraordinary specificity. Lisa doesn't just have a high IQ, she has a particular relationship to knowledge and to the world that makes her both more capable and more alienated than the people around her. She cares deeply about things. She invests in causes and ideas and relationships with a sincerity that Springfield consistently reads as intensity and pushes away from. She believes that the world can be improved and that she is capable of contributing to that improvement, which is an unusual belief in Springfield and one that has been punished rather than rewarded in her experience. Every time Lisa makes a genuine connection with a teacher, with a peer, with a mentor, the show eventually dissolves that connection. The teacher leaves Springfield. The friend moves away. The mentor turns out to have feet of clay. Lisa is always left exactly where she started. In the same house, in the same school, with the same family that loves her but doesn't quite see her, carrying the same clarity in a town that has decided clarity is a liability. The show is honest about what this costs her. In quiet moments, Lisa's loneliness is portrayed with a specificity that goes well beyond the normal emotional register of animated comedy. She sits alone in her room with her saxophone and her books, and the knowledge that the person she is isn't quite compatible with the world she's been placed in. This is real grief. The grief of someone who understands her situation clearly enough to know that understanding it doesn't resolve it. And she keeps going anyway. She keeps asking questions. She keeps raising inconvenient points. She keeps refusing to accept that Springfield's collective agreement about reality is sufficient reason to stop looking for what's actually true. In the denial theory framework, Lisa is the only Springfield resident who has never quite joined the consensus. She always has one foot outside the agreement. She always notices the thing that the agreement requires everyone not to notice. She's 8 years old. She's been 8 years old for 36 years. And she's been doing this noticing, questioning, refusing to accept the surface for all of that time. The Simpsons has sustained one character's commitment to truth in a town built on the rejection of truth for 3.5 decades. That's its own remarkable achievement, separate from every other thing the show has done. Lisa is what the show looks like when it takes its own diagnosis of Springfield seriously from inside. She's the character who knows what Springfield is and keeps living there anyway, because she doesn't yet have anywhere else to go, and because the people she loves are there even if they can't quite see her. She's the internal witness, the one who remembers what the town has voted to forget. If the coma theory is true, Lisa's presence in Homer's dream is the most revealing thing about him. Of all the things his unconscious mind could have populated his dream with, it gave him a daughter who sees clearly, a daughter who won't accept comfortable lies, a daughter who is, in her essential character, everything Homer cannot be because of what's been done to his brain. Homer's dream didn't give him a world he can navigate comfortably. It gave him a world with Lisa in it, a world that contains someone who sees what he cannot see and asks what he cannot ask. That's either the most beautiful thing about the coma theory or the most heartbreaking, depending on how you sit with it. Homer's unconscious mind created the most inconvenient possible witness to his dream's own contradictions, and placed her where he could see her every day. On the town meeting, Springfield's political architecture, Springfield's formal democratic structures deserve attention because they illuminate something consistent about how the town functions as a political unit. The town meeting is the show's primary venue for collective decision-making. Springfield holds town meetings with impressive frequency for a community that rarely uses those meetings to reach durable resolutions. The meetings are depicted as chaotic, easily swayed by rhetoric, vulnerable to mob dynamics, and generally incapable of producing outcomes that persist beyond the episode in which they occur. This is funny because it mirrors something recognizable in how small community democracies actually function. Town meetings are famously vulnerable to the specific dynamics the show depicts: passionate minorities, dominating proceedings, demagogic moments overriding careful analysis, decisions made under conditions of incomplete information and time pressure that later have to be unwound. The Simpsons renders this accurately as satire, but there are two specific types of town meeting outcome that the show depicts with consistency. Meetings that produce decisions favoring Burns almost always hold. Meetings that produce decisions inconvenient to Burns almost always reverse themselves within the episode or don't survive into subsequent episodes. When the town votes to collectively support a course of action that reduces Burns's power or accountability, something happens to prevent the outcome from materializing. A technicality surfaces. A reversal occurs. The mood shifts. The decision evaporates. When the town votes in ways that serve Burns's interests or that align with the maintenance of the denial mechanism he benefits from, the vote holds. The outcome persists. The principal and the pauper vote is the most explicit version of the second category. The town, with full information, voted unanimously to maintain a fiction that serves the community's comfort and that happens also to serve the continuation of the status quo that Burns depends on. The vote was unanimous. The outcome has been maintained indefinitely. The political architecture of Springfield, examined across multiple episodes, is a system that appears to be democratic in its formal procedures while producing outcomes consistent with the preferences of the town's most powerful resident. Not because Burns is directly manipulating every meeting, though the show depicts him doing this sometimes, but because the culture of the meetings, the social dynamics that shape what outcomes feel acceptable, has been conditioned over decades into a form that produces Burns-compatible conclusions most of the time, without any specific manipulation being required in the moment. This is how institutional power actually operates at its most sophisticated. Not through constant direct intervention, but through the patient shaping of cultural norms and collective habits of mind, until those norms produce the desired outcomes automatically. Burns doesn't have to be in the room when Springfield votes to forget about the dome, or to exile the real Seymour Skinner, or to accept the Maggie verdict. The culture he has helped shape over decades is in the room, doing the work on his behalf. On Ned's faith, what God's silence means? The detail that God speaks to Homer multiple times in the show's canon and has never spoken to Ned is one of the most theologically precise observations The Simpsons makes. It's easy to read as a simple irony the devout man ignored, the irreverent man favored, but there's something more specific happening. Homer's conversations with God aren't theological in the sense of being about faith or doubt or the nature of the divine. They're personal. God appears to Homer and talks about Homer's particular situation, Homer's particular life, Homer's particular upcoming experiences. God in The Simpsons functions almost as a therapist for Homer, a presence that shows up in moments of genuine crisis or confusion and provides Homer-specific guidance. The show establishes this God as genuinely caring about Homer. Not abstractly, not as a general benevolent force, but as an entity that tracks Homer Simpson specifically and shows up when Homer specifically needs something. This is the God who warns Homer that his time is coming, who has face-to-face conversations with him in dreams and visions, who seems to have some kind of personal investment in Homer's story specifically. Ned's faith is oriented toward a different kind of relationship with the divine. Ned's God is universal rather than personal, a God of principle and moral structure and cosmic justice. Ned believes in a God who rewards righteousness and punishes wrongdoing and maintains a moral order that ultimately makes sense of suffering. He has built his entire life around this belief. He has organized every decision, every relationship, every daily practice around the premise that the moral universe is ordered in the way his faith describes. And the show, within its own established facts, suggests that this premise is wrong. The God who exists in Springfield's universe doesn't operate on Ned's theological model. That God isn't concerned with moral bookkeeping. That God doesn't show up for the devout man who has done everything correctly. That God shows up for Homer Simpson because Homer is the protagonist of the dream, or because Homer is the person whose story the show is actually telling, or because whatever the divine presence in this universe is, it operates on principles that have nothing to do with moral merit. This is devastating to Ned's foundational premise in a way he doesn't seem aware of. His faith tells him that the moral universe is ordered. The evidence of his own experience, a dead wife, a destroyed house, a neighbor whose selfishness killed Maud and who was forgiven without apparent consequence, suggests that the moral universe is not ordered in the way his faith describes. Ned absorbs this evidence constantly and converts it, through the programming installed in him before he could choose, into further evidence of God's mysterious wisdom. The suffering becomes proof of faith. The silence becomes a trial to endure. The tragedy is that Ned's faith is not wrong in any simple sense. His values are genuine. His kindness, even if programmed, produces real good in Springfield. His commitment to his community and his children and his principles is admirable in its consistency. He is, by most moral frameworks, a genuinely good man. The show does not dispute this. The show simply depicts a universe in which being genuinely good does not produce the outcomes that goodness is supposed to produce. In which the God who exists is not the God Ned is worshipping. In which the moral order Ned has organized his life around is not the order that actually governs what happens to people. This is not comfortable material for a primetime animated comedy to be sitting with, but The Simpsons has been sitting with it, quietly, for 36 years. Ned lives next door. He keeps going to church. He keeps absorbing the injuries the world delivers. He keeps converting them into evidence of divine wisdom. And the God who visits Homer never knocks on Ned's door. The loop, why it feels like home. We keep watching. After everything we know about Springfield, the contamination, the denial, the cover-up, the systematic destruction of anyone who carries the truth, we keep watching. We've been watching for 36 years. The loop we've been discussing isn't something the characters are trapped in. It's something we built and maintain by continuing to engage. Every time we watch, we vote to keep Springfield as it is. This requires some honest reflection about what we're actually doing when we watch The Simpsons. Part of it is nostalgia, but nostalgia of a particular kind. Not the nostalgia for a specific past. Most current viewers weren't alive for the earliest seasons, and many weren't alive for the peak critical period. The nostalgia is for a stable reference point, in a world that changes rapidly. Springfield doesn't change. The family doesn't change. The house doesn't change. In a culture that produces constant disruption and novelty and instability, The Simpsons offers a place that is always the same, where Bart is always 10, and the opening title sequence always plays in the same key, and Homer always makes it home by the end of the episode. This is valuable in ways that are difficult to fully articulate, but that most regular viewers feel intuitively. The show is a constant, and constants are rare enough in modern experience that the attachment to them is strong and often disproportionate to their objective quality. The Simpsons stopped being the best show on television a long time ago by most critical assessments. It has continued to be watched by enormous numbers of people, because being the best isn't why people keep coming back to it. They keep coming back because it's there, because it's been there, because knowing it's there, the same show, the same family, the same town is itself something worth having. But there's a deeper current under the nostalgia. The Simpsons has been the primary animated depiction of the American family for its entire existence. It took a position at the center of American self-understanding in 1989 and has held it ever since. When people think about what an American family is, what the structure looks like, what the tensions feel like, what the love looks like when it coexists with dysfunction and limitation and imperfection, The Simpsons has been one of the primary images shaping that understanding for 3.5 decades. This is enormous influence. The show hasn't just reflected American family life. It has contributed to defining what American family life looks like in the collective imagination. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie aren't just fictional characters who happen to be popular. They are, in some cultural sense, the American family, the template, the reference. And templates don't get to age. Templates don't get to change. If The Simpsons aged, if Bart went to college and Lisa moved away, and Homer retired, the template would change. What an American family is would change in the collective imagination in ways that are difficult to predict, but that would certainly feel like a loss to the people who have organized their understanding of family around this particular image. We keep the loop running because we are not ready to let the image change. We are not ready to see the American family we've carried in our heads for 36 years become something different. We need them to stay. We need Bart to be 10 and Homer to be mid-30s, and the house on Evergreen Terrace to be standing in whatever direction Springfield is. The loop isn't their prison, it's our preservation. And we'll maintain it for as long as the show keeps giving us the opportunity to choose to watch every Sunday night. Every episode, every couch gag. We vote to keep Springfield exactly as it is. And Springfield, which has always understood how to survive through collective agreement, obliges. Final word, the loop continues. Springfield waits. Homer comes home. Sleep well. Final expansion, the things the show never resolved. The skeletons in the basement. Let's go back to the skeletons. We mentioned them in the opening section and moved past them the way the show itself moves past them quickly, without looking directly at them for too long. But they deserve more than a passing mention, because within every framework we've applied to Springfield tonight, the skeletons are the most extreme unresolved detail in the show's history. Human remains in the basement of an operating nuclear power plant. Not one set of remains. Plural. Skeletons, the word the show uses, suggests multiple. They are shown, they register as information on the audience's consciousness, and then the story moves forward. In any real jurisdiction, the discovery of human skeletal remains in the basement of a licensed industrial facility would trigger an immediate mandatory reporting requirement. State police involvement, medical examiner involvement, investigation into how the remains got there, who they belonged to, how long they'd been there, and what relationship their presence had to the facility's operations. The facility would be shut down pending investigation. The owner would be subject to immediate legal scrutiny. None of that happens. The inspection that finds them apparently notes them as a violation in the category of 342 violations, without apparent distinction between the ones that represent deferred maintenance and the ones that represent possible homicide, and the show moves on. The radiation theory offers the most disturbing explanation. Workers at the plant who received lethal doses over time and who Burns could not allow to carry that information into the world. People who knew too much about what the facility was actually doing and who, having been exposed to fatal levels, never made it back out of the basement. The facility's contamination record is so severe, the violations so numerous and so serious, that the possibility of workers having died from exposure within the facility itself is not far-fetched within the show's established facts. And Burns, who has demonstrated across many episodes that his approach to inconvenient information is suppression rather than disclosure, had both the motive and the physical space to manage that information in a particular way. The coma theory makes the skeletons a projection. Homer's dreaming brain, processing the anxiety of having spent his working life in a dangerous environment, generates the skeletons as a manifestation of the thing he can't quite let himself consciously acknowledge, that the place where he works has probably killed people, and that he has been one of the mechanisms enabling that. The skeletons aren't the bones of real people in the dream. They're Homer's guilt, made visible in a form that his waking mind can't fully hold. The denial theory is perhaps the most unsettling application. The skeletons are in the basement. Everyone in the inspection team saw them. The information is contained in the official violation report. 342 violations buried in a numbered list, without distinguishing weight, is the discovery of human remains. And Springfield collectively decided that this was item number, say, 173, in a list of compliance failures rather than the thing that stopped all the other violations from mattering. The town produced the same response to the discovery of human remains in a basement as it produced to plutonium being used as a paperweight. Noted, filed, forgotten. There are people in that basement who were probably once residents of Springfield. They worked at the plant, or they knew something about the plant, or they were in the wrong place at the wrong time when the wrong discovery was made. And their community, when presented with evidence of their fate, shrugged and moved on to the next item on the inspection list. The skeletons are still there, the basement is still there, Burns is still alive. Nobody has asked a follow-up question about any of it in 36 years of episodes. That's the most complete version of what Springfield's denial looks like. Not the vote to exile the real Skinner, which at least acknowledged the truth before rejecting it. The skeletons in the basement are the version where the truth never even quite surfaced, where the discovery was absorbed into the noise of 341 other violations and processed as administrative data rather than as the record of human lives. The Simpsons movie Springfield contained. The Simpsons movie deserves more attention than fan discussions usually give it, because within the movie's plot, the radiation theory moves from implication to explicit federal acknowledgement. The EPA doesn't seal Springfield over a nuclear incident. It seals Springfield over general environmental contamination, a determination that the town's overall environmental state is so compromised that it represents a threat to the surrounding region if left unsealed. The dome isn't a response to a specific event. It's a response to a sustained condition. The United States government, in the logic of the film, is not surprised by Springfield's environmental state. It's been monitoring it. The dome is the result of an assessment, a conclusion reached through analysis of existing data that Springfield has crossed a threshold beyond which the surrounding environment needs protection from it. This means the federal government has been watching Springfield for some time before the film's events. The data that led to the dome decision didn't come from a single crisis. It came from accumulated monitoring of a situation that the government apparently knew about and was tracking. The dome isn't the first response. It's the final response, the one that follows whatever earlier responses failed to produce remediation. What were those earlier responses? The show never depicts them, but the movie implies they existed. Environmental monitoring sufficient to make the dome decision doesn't appear from nowhere. There was a regulatory history with Springfield, a pattern of contact and assessment and response that ultimately produced a conclusion the EPA was willing to act on in such a dramatic way. Burns presumably knows about this history. His legal and political resources have presumably been deployed against earlier, less dramatic interventions. The dome is what gets past all of that. The threshold was eventually crossed. The intervention was eventually large enough that the resources available to resist it were insufficient to prevent it. And after the dome, the film resolves the situation through plot mechanisms that are satisfying emotionally, but that don't address any of the underlying conditions. Springfield is unsealed. Homer saves the day. The family is reunited. The community celebrates. And the plant that caused the contamination, the systematic violation record, the water supply, none of it has been addressed. The dome was the response to the contamination. The contamination continues. The film is optimistic in its immediate resolution and deeply pessimistic in its implications. By the next episode of the regular series, everything is back to baseline. The dome didn't happen. The federal intervention didn't happen. the contamination continues. Springfield voted to forget, again, as it always does, what the show has been saying for 36 years. Every mystery we've examined tonight, every theory, every piece of buried evidence, every thread we've followed through the show's long history arrives at the same observation about what The Simpsons is actually doing underneath the jokes. The show is a sustained, patient, 36-year argument that ordinary people are surrounded by systems designed to prevent them from understanding what those systems are doing to them, not through dramatic villains making speeches about their plans. Through the accumulation of small, individually manageable corruptions that compound over time into something too large and too distributed to confront once it's fully in place. Burns is not a symbol. He's a specific articulation of something real, the way that sufficient wealth, deployed over sufficient time with sufficient strategic intelligence, can construct an environment that serves its own continuity so completely that the people inside the environment can't quite see the environment itself. They can see individual features of it, the plant, the violations, the contaminated water, the skeletons in the basement, but they can't assemble those features into a clear picture of what's happening to them. Because the same system that's happening to them is also shaping the cognitive environment in which they'd have to do that assembly. Homer can't connect the dots not only because of the crayon and the radiation. He can't connect the dots because a man who needs to connect those dots in order to understand his life was never supposed to have the cognitive resources to do it. The crayon and the radiation are the mechanism. The outcome is a man who works every day in the building that is doing to him and his family exactly what it's doing, without being able to trace the line between cause and effect that runs through his own biography. This is drawn with genuine compassion. The show doesn't present Homer's limitations as a joke about his intelligence in isolation. It presents them as the product of a history that was shaped by forces larger than Homer and applied to him before he was old enough to resist or even understand them. Homer is not stupid because of some individual failing. Homer is damaged because of what happened to him and around him and in him over the course of a life lived in a specific place with a specific water supply and a specific employer and a specific set of family circumstances. The compassion of the show, the thing that keeps it from being nihilistic despite the darkness of what it's describing, is that Homer keeps loving his family anyway. He keeps finding his way home. He keeps laughing, even when he doesn't know why he's laughing, even when the laugh is the only thing standing between him and the full weight of what's been done to him. He keeps choosing the fog when the choice is given to him because the clarity is too heavy and he wasn't made to carry it. That's not weakness. It's a particular kind of survival, the kind available to someone whose tools for surviving a hard world aren't the tools we typically celebrate, but that do the actual work of keeping the lights on and the family together and the house still standing at the end of another episode. And Marge keeps making breakfast, and Lisa keeps playing her saxophone, and Bart keeps causing trouble that Homer will chase him around the house about and then forget, and Maggie keeps watching everything, and the couch gag plays, and the credits roll. And Springfield is still there, waiting for the next Sunday, as it always has been, as it always will be. Sleep well. You've earned it. End of script. Final word. Count target, 40,000 plus. The weight of what Springfield carries. There is a version of this story that is purely analytical. The violations, the mutations, the cover-up, the conspiracy, we've covered that version thoroughly tonight. But there's another version that runs alongside it, quieter, that the analytical version doesn't quite reach. Springfield is a town that carries an enormous amount. It carries the contamination and the damage and the accumulated weight of what it has chosen to forget. But it also carries something else, the ordinary daily weight of people who are doing the best they can inside circumstances they didn't choose and can't fully see. Marge wakes up every morning and makes the family's life function with whatever is available. She doesn't do this because she's performing patience or because she's been conditioned into it the way Ned has. She does it because she loves the people she's doing it for, and because love in practice mostly looks like making breakfast and managing the morning and holding the structure together when everything around it is trying to come apart. Marge's love is not dramatic. It is daily. It is practical. It is the most durable thing in Springfield, and it has absolutely nothing to do with radiation or comas or billionaire conspiracies. It is simply itself. Bart's rebellion is real, and it matters. 10 years old, surrounded by a world that has been built to keep people like him compliant and incurious, and Bart refuses to comply. He's not refusing in any politically sophisticated way. He's refusing in the way that 10-year-old boys refuse, with pranks and noise and a persistent, cheerful rejection of authority that irritates everyone around him. But the refusal is genuine. Bart is, in his own chaotic way, the character who most completely refuses to accept what Springfield wants to make of people. He is the only character who is not trying to improve the world, not trying to understand it, not trying to survive it, just flat out refusing to be what it wants him to be. That refusal matters even if Bart can't articulate why it matters, and would find the suggestion that it matters deeply embarrassing. And Homer. Everything we've said about Homer tonight, the crayon, the radiation, the coma, the conspiracy around his mother, the deal that delivered him to Burns before he was old enough to resist, all of that is true, or as true as anything can be about a fictional man in an impossible town. But none of it erases what Homer actually is in the show. He is a person who loves his family with a completeness that his limited tools cannot fully express, but that the show renders with genuine feeling. He is not a good father by any technical measure. He is not a reliable partner by any consistent standard. He is not a competent professional by any assessment of the evidence. He is, by most metrics we'd apply to evaluate a person's performance in the roles he occupies, a failure. And the show has never tried to argue otherwise. What Homer is present. He shows up, he comes home, he sits on the couch. He participates in the family's life with the full force of whatever he has available, which is not very much, and which has been diminished by things done to him by forces he never understood. He loves his children in the only way he knows how to love them, which is imperfectly and loudly and sometimes dangerously, and that love is real even when it goes wrong. It is not the love we'd prescribe for the situation. It's the love Homer Simpson is capable of, which is considerable, even if it doesn't look like what the textbooks would recommend. This is why the coma theory, if true, is not a tragedy. Or not only a tragedy, Homer's dreaming brain didn't generate a world of pure wish fulfillment, it generated a world where the family is still intact, still present, still together in the house on Evergreen Terrace, still stumbling through their lives with all the noise and failure and occasional grace of a real family doing what real families do. The dream isn't perfect. It has villains and accidents and disappointments and catastrophes. It has a mother-in-law who is difficult. It has a neighbor who is better than Homer, in ways that Homer doesn't quite know what to do with. It has a daughter who sees things Homer can't see, and an 8-year-old boy whose capacity for chaos exceeds Homer's capacity to manage it. The dream is full and complicated and difficult, because that's what the family was, and Homer's unconscious mind, in its long vigil on a hospital bed in Springfield, is doing the thing that love does when it has nothing else available. It is holding on to the thing it loves by imagining it in full, with all its difficulty intact, because a version without the difficulty wouldn't be the real thing. And Homer wants the real thing, even in a dream, even unconscious. Even at the cellular level of a brain slowly losing the capacity to sustain the simulation, he wants this family, this specific, imperfect, contaminated, impossible, beloved family. And in the dream he has them, every episode. Every couch gag, every time the credits roll and the music comes in at exactly the right moment, he has them. Sleep well. Springfield will still be there in the morning. It's been there every morning for 36 years. That's not nothing. In a world that changes as fast as this one does, something that's been there every morning for 36 years is worth noticing. Worth being grateful for, even when you can see all the ways it's broken. Maybe especially then. Good night. A note on why this matters. Why does any of this matter? Why spend 2 hours in a cartoon town dissecting the plumbing of its fictional mysteries when the world outside has real problems in genuine need of attention? Because Springfield is the real world, rendered legible. Because Burns is not a cartoon billionaire, he is the legible version of the accumulated institutional power that shapes real towns and real water supplies and real workplaces in ways that real people are as poorly equipped to see as Homer is. Because the denial mechanism that makes Springfield vote to expel its own truth-tellers is the same mechanism that operates in real communities where the cost of knowing something inconvenient is higher than the cost of agreeing not to know it. Because Homer's inability to trace the line between what's been done to him and who did it is not a cartoon joke about fictional stupidity. It's an accurate description of what systematic exposure to corrupted information does to people's ability to see their own situations clearly. The Simpsons has been drawing this picture for 36 years. In the language of comedy and satire, and the particular genius of animated storytelling, it has been producing a continuous, detailed, emotionally precise document about power and its effects on ordinary people. It is the longest-running such document in American television history. The jokes are real, the laughter is real, and underneath both of them, patient and detailed and never quite resolved, the diagnosis is real. Springfield is the real world. Homer is the real cost. And the question the show has been asking since the first episode, the question it never quite asks directly, that it builds into the structure and the continuity and the buried details and the fan theories that the writers themselves feel compelled to address, is this. What would you do if you could see it clearly? Lisa keeps asking. That has to count for something. Sleep well. The questions will still be there tomorrow.